terms of the format today. I think yesterday the first session was a bit long. We had the break quite late in the day, so today we're going to have the break at around 2:30. I mean, I'm not going to say exactly because we need to find a natural point to stop, but it'll be around 2:30. We'll have a half an hour break, and my aim today, the subject is Incoterms. I hope I'm not wrong on this occasion, but that always elicits questions, comments, lots of discussion. So my aim is to try and, if you like, me finish talking by 4 o'clock UK time at the latest, leaving a full half hour for Q&A at the end, maybe even a bit more than that if we can. We'll see how it goes. So let me share my screen. Okay, can I just check if someone can tell me, can you see the screen, please, in full size?
I can see it.
Yeah, okay, you've got it. Great. So this session is Incoterms 2020. Incoterms are the core of every international trade contract. Get the Incoterm right, and the contract is likely to go well. Get it wrong, and disputes are likely to be extremely expensive. It's as simple as that. So, it really is an important subject. And I always say to people, when we kind of run these training courses covering all the elements of supply chains, if there's one, if you just want one takeaway from it, the takeaway should be the correct use of Incoterms. It really is crucial. And I think I mentioned yesterday that virtually every international trade contract globally is intended to be covered by Incoterms, but it's estimated that about 70 to 80% of the time an inappropriate term or a wrong term is being used, which is quite a worry. So there we go. The current version, as you probably know, is Incoterms 2020. And, things move very, very quickly. We're now in 2025. And I think it was only last week I was approached by the International Chamber of Commerce to start thinking about what Incoterms 2030 is going to look like. Because when we review Incoterms, and I always, well, not always, the last 3 revisions of Incoterms, I've been part of the review body. But it's a long process. Before a new version comes into play, it takes 3 or 4 years of consulting with every country in the world, anyone who wants to get involved in the review process. It's a long consultation period before we actually come up with the revised version. So there will be an Incoterms 2030. A bit later on, I'll talk a little bit more about the review process and how it works. I have to show you that I'm legally authorized to teach Incoterms. Unfortunately, globally, there is so much bad and incorrect teaching of Incoterms that the International Chamber of Commerce decided that you now have to be licensed to teach it. So legally, I have to show you that I do have my accreditation to teach Incoterms. You can see it on the screen. I have passed the exam, you'll be pleased to know. It was a horrible exam, but fortunately I passed it. There we go. So that was the previous version. Some of you may recognize the branding, and of course that is the current version. Let's do a shout out on this. Just shout yes if you've got the Incoterms book. This book here, the one you can see on the screen. Shout yes if you have it in your offices.
Yes.
Great, there was one yes there. I'm hoping there's going to be a few more. Okay, well, look, all I would say at this stage is that is the book you cannot do without. There is only one correct version of Incoterms, and that's what you find in that book. If you Google Incoterms, you will get the biggest load of rubbish ever. It's one of the very, very big issues. Even the biggest shipping line in the world, I'm not going to name them, you all know who they are. The biggest shipping line in the world, they put Incoterms on their website, they have got it wrong. The only true source is the Incoterms publication. So we'll come back to that a bit later. But, frankly, anyone involved in international trade needs that book. There's no alternative. You need the book. That is the reference for Incoterms. So anyway, what's it all about? It stands for International Commercial Terms. First version came out in 1936. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And it tends to get revised, or it does get revised now, about every 10 years. There's no law that says it has to be revised every 10 years, but that's been the pattern since 1980. We've had an Incoterms 1980, 1990, 2020, 2000, 2010, 2020, and there will be an Incoterms 2030. So it does get revised every 10 years at the moment. Is it an international legal requirement to use Incoterms in every contract? No, except for one exception. The only exception is in Ukraine, public procurement law says Incoterms have to be used for public procurement. But no other country has a legal requirement in their legislation to use Incoterms. Having said that, of course, the reality is that once you put an Incoterm in your contract, then both sides, seller and buyer, are legally bound by that Incoterm. So even though, apart from public procurement in Ukraine, no one says you have to use Incoterms, once you put them in the contract, you are bound by the Incoterms rules as enshrined in the Incoterms book. Does it make sense to use Incoterms in every contract? Yes, it does. And most people, it's been estimated. I mean, as I mentioned yesterday, statistics can be difficult, they can be misleading. But it's estimated that about 98% of world trade is intended to be under Incoterms. Although sometimes, even though the traders think it's under Incoterms, it isn't, because they haven't mentioned the word Incoterm in the contract, and therefore they're not protected by Incoterms. But it's estimated the intention is 98% of world trade is under Incoterms. But as I mentioned earlier on, a huge proportion of that, an inappropriate Incoterm, may be being used. Does it make sense to use Incoterms in every contract? Absolutely yes, because it's an international standard. It's a global standard. If you like, it provides the language for an international trade contract. And that's a really good way to look at Incoterms, as the language for any international trade contract. Current version is Incoterms 2020. As I've mentioned, there will be, going by the 10-year rule, and also because the ICC have announced it to people like me, they announced it a few weeks ago, there will be an Incoterms 2030. There will be a review process, which will probably start working on that, I would imagine, next year, because it takes 3 or 4 years to do an Incoterms review. So what's it all about? Let me just go back. So, the history is actually quite interesting, and the history tells you how it all came about. So, if we think back to the 1920s, all those years ago, over a century ago, the First World War had come to an end. And there was a view globally that if countries are trading with each other, they won't be fighting with each other. After the First World War, they called it the war to end all wars. And there really was this view that if countries trade with each other, they won't fight with each other. Nice idea. We can look back and say, well, it hasn't really worked very well, but that was the view at the time. So in the 1920s, the International Chamber of Commerce was established, but they didn't really have a role. You can imagine what it was like. They're established. They've got their headquarters in Paris, which they still have. And basically, they're told you're an international organization. Your role is very simple. Your role is to facilitate international trade. Those 3 words are 3 words we hear a lot nowadays: facilitate international trade. But there's nothing new in that. That's what they were told their role was. So you can imagine, new international organization, they're sitting at their office in Paris, they're told that's what your role is: facilitate international trade. They didn't have a clue what to do or where to start. Can you imagine how hard the research must have been? No internet, no long distance phones, communications really difficult. You couldn't fly anywhere, really, really hard to discuss things. So they had a very, very difficult job and they didn't know what to do. And it took them quite a while to really have a look at the international trading environment and what it involved. And it took them a while, but one of their takeaways, and their most important takeaway, was they discovered that, not surprisingly, international trade contracts were huge, huge documents because there were no standards in international trade. So if you're an exporter and you've got 10 customers overseas in one country or in 10 different countries, every single contract would be different. You would negotiate it and the terms, conditions would be different for every contract. Every detail of the transaction would have to go into the contract. So even for the most simple, low value sale of goods across a border, a contract would typically be 100, 200 pages, typically, even if the value was very low. So the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce, they decided that actually a really good intervention they could have would be to develop standard trading conditions, standard ways of trading. And if the seller and buyer agreed to use one of these standard ways of trading, they didn't have to have huge contracts. All they had to do would be to write down in their contract the 3-letter code for one of those standards. And then all the seller and buyer would have to do is they wouldn't have to put anything in the contract. They would just refer to the book, which would have a definition of what that code means. And those codes became known as Incoterms, International Commercial Terms. And the first version of Incoterms came out in 1936. It took them a while to get it together. And there were 3 standard ways of trading initially. And they were called FOB, CFR, or at the time it's called C&F, not CFR, FOB, C&F, and CIF. Those were the 3 standards. And they published the book. And in that book, for those 3 standard ways of trading, FOB, C&F, and CIF, there would be an absolute definition of what those terms mean for the seller and what they mean for the buyer. And what that meant was, as long as they put one of those terms in the contract, they could cut a contract from being 100 pages, for example, to being 10 pages or 5 pages, because everything else was in the Incoterms book. And nothing has changed since. Well, no, I shouldn't say nothing has changed. A lot has changed since then. But, in terms of the way it works, nothing has changed since then. Basically, in your contract, you put an Incoterm, and then everything you need to know is in the Incoterms book. If you've got an FCA contract, you look up FCA in the book. I'm just trying to briefly find it. And that would tell you everything you need to know about what's involved in that contract. So basically, what you end up with are standard ways of trading. Now, when you have standard international rules, yesterday we spoke a lot about rules-based systems for customs valuations, for rules of origin, and so on and so on. When you have a rules-based system, there are really 2 ways of putting the rules together. One way is you can simply say to international traders, you can say, okay, here are the rules, here are the Incoterms rules, here's the book, follow the rules. That's one way of doing it. When 2030 comes, we could say, okay, here's Incoterms 2030, everyone, follow the rules. That's one way of doing it. That would be a quick and easy way to do it. The other way to do it is you look at what really happens on the ground in an international trade contract. How the contract is performed, how the goods are shipped, how they're paid for, how they're insured, the risks involved, the amount of risk a seller is prepared to take, the amount of risk a buyer is prepared to take. And you design the rules based on the way things really happen on the ground. Because things change day by day, month by month, year by year. And actually, it's the second concept that we do with Incoterms. We don't just get together as a group with, because Incoterms are international, every country has an involvement in the review. But we don't just all get together and say, let's make these changes. We have a huge consultation process globally. And anyone involved in international supply chains, exporters, importers, freight forwarders, customs brokers, banks, insurance companies, customs agencies, ministries of trade, standards ministries, everyone involved in the international supply chain can make comments. They can make suggestions about changes they want to see in Incoterms reflecting current practice. And that's how the reviews take place. We look at current practice, we take views from every country in the world, and then we do 3 drafts before we come to the final version. The final version is ratified by lawyers, and then it's translated into different languages. It's a long, long process. I've been involved in the last 3 reviews of Incoterms, Incoterms 2000, Incoterms 2010, and Incoterms 2020. After I got involved with Incoterms 2000, I said to myself, never again. You know, you spend hours and hours and hours discussing the most simple basic point in the basement of the ICC in Paris, you know, involving lots of people from different countries. It takes ages to get to any conclusions. And after Incoterms 2000, I said, I will never do this again. And then I got involved in Incoterms 2010. Then I said, I will never do this again. And then I got involved in Incoterms 2020. And I think I'm probably going to be doing it for Incoterms 2030 because they've asked me. So we'll see how that goes. But essentially, it's quite right that it's done that way. It needs to be a long and inclusive process. So we have regular revisions of Incoterms, and that's because things change so quickly in international trade. And when we do a review of Incoterms, what we do is, because, you know, the format or the timescales at the moment is Incoterms are reviewed every 10 years. So when a new version comes out, it has to be valid for the next 10 years. Incoterms are never amended in the interim. You get Incoterms 2020, the next one will be Incoterms 2030. There's no changes in between. Those rules have got to last 10 years without being changed. So when we do the review, we look at what has changed in international trade over the previous 10 years. That's the easy bit, you know, because it's happened. You know, what has changed over the last 10 years, and we make sure we make any technical adjustments based on changes that have happened in the previous 10 years. That's the easy bit. But then we have to predict what could happen in the next 10 years. So, you know, when we did Incoterms 2020, we knew they would have to last till 2030. So we would have to consider what could happen in the intervening period and make sure that the terms remain fit for purpose during their validity. And that's harder because you never know what's going to happen. So the review process is long. And when you look at the updates, when you look at the reviews, as you can see in the 3rd point on the screen at the moment, and just to give you a little bit of background, so the first version was 1936. 1953 background was basically so that Incoterms would work for air freight. Because before that, it was very, very unusual for cargoes to be shipped commercially by air. It was actually the Berlin airlift. That's what put air freight on the scene as a way of moving cargoes around the world, apart from for military use. So 1953, that revision was really all about making Incoterms fit for air freight as well as sea freight and road and rail. That's what the 53 revision was all about. 1967 it was cosmetic changes, no major changes, but cosmetic changes to make Incoterms easier to use. Then the big thing with 1976 and 1980, the big thing there, of course, was containerization. So during the 70s, containerization came in, the use of standard size containers on container ships. And it was suddenly realized that the traditional Incoterms like FOB, CFR, CIF did not work if the goods are in containers. You know, you can't use FOB, CFR, CIF if the goods are in containers. And that was recognized round about 1980. So a big revision in 1980 to make it clear to everyone that if the goods are in containers, you can't use FOB, FAS, CFR, CIF. It doesn't work if the goods are in containers. And that's still an issue. We still get importers and exporters using those terms when the goods are in containers. So that's what the 1976 and 1980 revision was all about. 1990, again, was mainly cosmetic changes and quite a lot of changes in the D group terms. I'll be talking about the individual terms later on. So 1990, again, mainly cosmetic, but some changes mainly with the D group Incoterms. Then 2000, the big thing in 2000 was there was a belief that shortly after 2000, by around about 2005, paper documents would be out. Everyone would be using electronic messages instead of paper documents. So in Incoterms 2000, there was a huge emphasis on the fact that traders, importers and exporters, if they wish, they could agree to use electronic messages instead of paper documents, with a view, as I've mentioned, that by 2005, no one would be using paper anymore. How wrong we were. That was entirely wrong, and it was suddenly realized that actually this migration to electronic messages instead of paper documents was not going to happen by 2005. We're now in 2025 and it still hasn't happened. So, the review teams don't always get it right, but that was the belief at the time. Then the 2010 revision. The 2010 revision, there was a reduction in the number of terms. Up till 2000, there were 14 Incoterms. It was too many, and the International Chamber of Commerce recognised that. So they tasked us with finding a way to reducing the number of terms, and we reduced them from 14 terms to 11 terms. The reductions were mainly in the D group terms. As I said, I'll look at all the individual terms a bit later on. So that's what the 2010 revision was all about, and actually quite a big change with FOB, CFR and CIF. 2020, there were, what you tend to get when there's a review of Incoterms, you tend to get maybe 3 or 4 very major fundamental changes and lots and lots and lots of smaller changes. And certainly that's what happened in 2020. So in 2020, the big change was in insurance requirements for CIP and CIF. That was the really big change in 2020. Some other smaller changes, another big change, we changed one of the D terms from DAT to DPU, and some smaller cosmetic changes as well. 1 or 2 quite small changes, but big impact, which I'll talk about later on. And, as I say, we haven't started talking about Incoterms 2030 yet, but, probably towards the end of next year, probably about the middle of next year, the groups will start to get together to look at what changes may be needed in the run up, or, as we review Incoterms and come up with a draft of what Incoterms 2030 should actually look like. So they do get updated very regularly, or every 10 years, which, is fairly regularly. And the whole idea is to make sure they reflect current practice and anticipated future practice, because they have to be workable 10 years after they've been published. So let me just put this in. Oops. So what's it all about? And the key thing here is the acronym DROC, D-R-O-C, DROC. You can see that in the first bullet point. Incidentally, it was quite funny because last year I was doing quite a lot of teaching in some of the Southeast African countries, in Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mozambique, Malawi. I did a kind of roadshow around those countries. And Incoterms was one of the key subjects. And what I learned very, very quickly, I think the first country I did it in I did the training in was in Zambia. I arrived in Zambia first, yeah. So it was in Lusaka in Zambia. And I was talking about Incoterms, and I mentioned the acronym DROC, and I saw loads of confused faces in the room. I looked around the room and I could see people looking very, very confused, and I wasn't sure why. I thought to myself, I'm clearly not explaining this very well. I need to do better on this. And then before I had a chance to kind of roll back a bit and find a different way of explaining it. A gentleman got up, and in Zambia they're very, very polite. And when you do face-to-face training, until I told them to relax and not to do it, if they wanted to ask a question, they would stand up to ask the question. Anyway, this guy stood up and he said, "Please, could you explain what has this got to do with drug?" And I said, "Okay, let me explain that again." And he said, "Because we don't understand. What has this got to do with the Democratic Republic of Congo?" And then it suddenly hit me, of course, in that region, when you talk about DROC as an acronym, it's Democratic Republic of Congo. But that's not what it means in the Incoterms context. It means delivery, risk, obligation, cost. And those are the four purposes of Incoterms. And that's an easy way to remember them by the acronym DROG. So D for delivery. Again, we'll expand on these a bit later on, but just to start off, with an overview. Okay, so delivery. And that means we need to define the exact point where the goods are legally delivered from the seller to the buyer. And that links with risk, because the point at which the goods are legally delivered, that's where the risk of the goods getting lost, stolen, damaged, pilfered, water damage, anything bad happening to them, that's where the risk passes from the seller to the buyer. So the D is the legal delivery point. And one of the key things which I hope you'll draw out of the training today is that as long as, from the seller's point of view, as long as you don't use an Incoterm beginning with the letter D, you legally deliver when you dispatch the goods, not when they arrive. Okay? Legal delivery if the Incoterm begins with the letter E, F, or C, you legally deliver when the goods are dispatched. And that can be confusing, because if you're talking about a C group Incoterm, CPT, CIP, CFR, CIF, the seller has got to get the goods to the agreed arrival point. However, the seller legally delivers on dispatch, not when they reach that arrival point. So it can get a little bit confusing. But the delivery point, the legal delivery point, links with when the risk passes from the seller to the buyer. So every Incoterm, there are 11 terms. For each one of them, all we do is we look in the book, and that would tell us where the goods are legally delivered. And that will also align with where the risk passes from seller to buyer. The O is for obligation. In every supply chain, there are lots of activities going on. There are lots of obligations, and we need to know what the seller is obliged to do and what the buyer is obliged to do. It's not guesswork. We need to be absolutely clear, no grey areas. What are the seller's obligations? Who loads the container when it arrives at the warehouse? It's not always as it seems. Who has the risk of doing that? And who has the obligation of doing it? Who arranges international transportation? Who arranges domestic transportation? Who arranges export customs clearance? Who arranges export security clearance? Who loads the goods at the port? Who unloads them from the aircraft on arrival? Who pays the duty on arrival? Who does import customs clearance? Who applies for the export license? It's not always as it seems. So we need to have absolute clarity. What are the seller's obligations under each of the 11 terms? And what are the buyer's obligations under each of the 11 terms? And then finally, in a supply chain, for each activity, there's going to be a cost. Even if it's just producing documents, there's a cost in doing that. So who pays the cost, the seller or the buyer? We can't have guesswork. Otherwise, we would have a huge number of disputes. So for each of the 11 terms, it's very, very clear in Incoterms what the seller has to pay for and what the buyer has to pay for. So for each of the 11 terms, it's made absolutely clear, no grey areas. It's made it very, very clear where the goods are legally delivered, where the risk of something bad happening to the goods passes from seller to buyer, what the seller has to do under the contract, and what the buyer has to do under the contract in relation to obligations, and in relation to cost, what the seller has to pay for and what the buyer has to pay for. So as long as Incoterms are correctly incorporated in the contract, it should really cut down the necessity for disputes. And it does. It really does, as long as an appropriate Incoterm has been used. Because everything you need to know, as long as you put Incoterms into the contract, everything you need to know in relation to seller's obligation, seller's risk, seller's cost, buyer's obligation, buyer's risk, buyer's cost, everything is in the Incoterms book. You simply look up the term in the book, and we'll have a look at what it looks like a bit later on, and that will tell you everything you need to know. So let me pause there. Any questions, any comments so far? Okay. So global misunderstanding of Incoterms, sadly, but there is. And this is global. It's no one particular country getting it wrong. I find this in every country where I go to train people. And to be honest, globally, the subject I'm asked to teach more than any other subject is actually Incoterms, because I think there's a growing view that, it is misunderstood. And, these kind of horror stories, you hear them everywhere. There are some examples there. Now, the middle one is quite interesting. And there's lots of, there's something wrong with all of these that you can see on the screen at the moment. But the middle one is interesting. There was one company I went into to do some consultancy for them, and they were a huge company. And I'm not going to mention the name, it would be wrong to do that. But to give you an indication of their size, they make all the packaging for McDonald's, love them or hate them, McDonald's hamburgers, they do all the packaging for McDonald's in Europe. They make all the packaging. And I went to do some training for them. They wanted their whole of their export department to be trained. So I went in there. They gave me an example of their price list. And the middle bullet point is what it said. It showed for each type of product they made, it gave a unit price, FOB, and a unit price, CFR, and it gave the same price. Now, you can't have that, as you'll see later on. I recognize not all of you may be familiar with Incoterms, but as you'll see later on, that it can't be the same price, because an FOB price would not include international transport, but a CFR price would include international transport. So a CFR price is always going to be higher than an FOB price. That was the first thing that was wrong. The second thing that was wrong is that FOB and CFR can only be used for bulk, non-container sea freight. And they were always, like most organizations now, they were always shipping their cargoes in containers. And if they're shipped in containers, you can't use FOB and CFR. And this was a huge, huge organization. So the reason I mentioned that is, don't think it's only the smaller kind of organizations that get it wrong, because that's not the case. Very, very often it's the multinationals as well. I was it was a few months ago now. I was speaking at one of the automotive industry's international conferences, their trade organization. They have several, but one of their trade organizations' international conferences. And I was talking about supply chain disruption in general. The subject of Incoterms came up, and it wasn't really the subject of what I was talking about, but the subject came up. And so, there was a question which I answered. And one of the biggest automotive companies, the biggest car producers in the world, recognized suddenly from what I told them in answer to their question, that they had been getting Incoterms wrong for 40 years. So the reason I make that point is because sometimes people say to me, maybe it's just the smaller organizations that get them wrong. It's not the case at all. It really isn't. There's a huge global problem in the application of Incoterms, and that problem isn't dependent on the size of the organization. It really isn't. It can be a micro company, one or two people, or it can be a multinational car manufacturer. There's a lot of misinformation around, sadly. And the point is, the contract may not be all it seems. So in our contracting, we spoke a bit yesterday in general about what the contents of a contract should look like. And it's so important to get the contract absolutely watertight as best as we can, because the contract may not be all it seems. Look at the picture you can see on the screen at the moment. No bill of lading is going to tell you that's the way the containers are being delivered to the port. It's not going to say that. You won't know that from the bill of lading. But if you've got material in one of those containers, you've got a metal in one of those containers, would you be happy about it if you hold the risk? And you would certainly want to know in that contract if you have the risk. So by using Incoterms, we can control these things. We can actually mitigate risk in our contracts. Because, international trade is risky. There's a lot that can go wrong. There's a huge amount that can go wrong. From my point of view, I would say that's what makes international trade exciting. Other people may have different expressions they would use about that, but there's a huge amount that can go wrong. So when there's a review of Incoterms, as I've mentioned, we always look at what's new in the international trade environment. What is new? What's happened in the previous 10 years, which may trigger a change that we need to make in the next review of Incoterms, and what could happen, or what's on the agenda for the coming years. And that helps us come up with a final version of Incoterms which is fit for purpose. And these are just some examples of things that were new that we had to bear in mind in the Incoterms review. So things like the trusted trader regimes, which many of you will know. I'll talk more about this next week. But under the World Customs Organization, the SAFE framework of standards, the world is now divided between trusted traders and those who have not been accredited as trusted traders. The world is divided. It's purely voluntary to be a trusted trader. It's a good thing to be, but we'll talk about that next week. But this was a new protocol. It was absolutely new, and it's incorporated in different ways in different countries. So, in most countries, certainly in the European Union, in the UK, we call it AEO, Authorized Economic Operator. And that's a really good qualification for a trader to have because they're given customs privileges. For those of you in the States, you're probably aware it's called CTPAT. You guys in the States like it to be a bit more dramatic, I think. So in the States, it's not called AEO, Authorized Economic Operator. It's called the Customs and Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. Bit more dramatic, but the point is the same. It's all about supply chain security. That's what it's all about, trusted trader regimes. And these were something new some years ago. So we had to consider, did that trigger a change in Incoterms? We had big discussions about that. In the end, we decided it didn't trigger a change in the next version of Incoterms. But that's the kind of thing that we had to look at. We had to do a kind of sanity check to see if changes were necessary because of an important new regime that was coming into play. Certainly something that was new, and this is, these are things which aren't really, or this was something which wasn't really a cliff edge change. But over the years, we've seen a gradual change in the way goods are shipped globally. So, when I started my career, as I always say, in those days when I had hair on my head, when my career started, it was, the normal thing when you were shipping goods around the world, it would be port to port shipping, airport to airport, freight forwarder to freight forwarder. Nowadays, people want door-to-door logistics. Smart intermodal logistics solutions are becoming the way of the world. Now, because of that, it didn't really trigger changes in Incoterms, but it did trigger changes in the detail on some of the terms to make sure that they worked where they had to work for door-to-door shipping and multimodal shipping as much as they work for one mode of shipping, port to port, airport to airport, freight yard to freight yard. So smart intermodal logistics solutions, that's pretty important. Insurance clauses, we have standard insurance clauses globally. Again, we'll look at those next week. Those are called the Institute Cargo Clauses, and they change from time to time. They get fine-tuned from time to time. So whenever there's an Incoterms review, we have to make sure that the insurance requirements of Incoterms, there are two Incoterms where insurance is compulsory, CIP and CIF. The clue is in the I. If there's an I in the Incoterm, it is compulsory that the cargo is insured. Okay, and there's only two terms where it's compulsory, CIP and CIF. So we have to make sure for CIP and CIF that what we put in Incoterms aligns with the standard Institute cargo clauses. And what we'll talk about later and what you'll see later on is that there is a very, very big fundamental change in this in Incoterms 2020, a fundamental change in insurance requirements. Now, later on, I'm going to talk about what Incoterms don't cover, because again, there's a lot of misinformation there. And even though they don't cover payment, the place, the method, the currency of payment, they can have an impact on payments. Because many, many companies now, very, very, and this is global, many, many companies now, what they do is what their accounts departments do is exporters recognize revenue at the point where the goods are legally delivered under the Incoterm prevailing in the contract. So they link the Incoterm, the legal delivery point, not the physical delivery point, the legal delivery point, with the stage at which revenue can be recognized. So even though Incoterms don't impact on the method, time, or currency of payment, they've got to align with them again. And particularly, they've got to align with the letter of credit rules, UCP 600. And actually, again, there's quite a fundamental change that we made in Incoterms 2020, because there was a gap that we've known about for a while, but no one knew what to do about it. In Incoterms 2020, we found a solution which we've incorporated in the terms. I'll talk more about that later. And of course, nowadays, and we spoke about this a little bit yesterday, the world is dependent on global value chains. Every country is import dependent to some extent. Remember that number I gave you yesterday? The cup of Starbucks coffee comes from goods and services of 27 different countries. Okay, and that just gives you an idea of what we mean by global value chains. So we live in a world of global value chains. We have to do a sanity check every time there's a review of the terms to make sure each term incorporated in Incoterms does work under the umbrella, if you like, of a global value chain. As I mentioned, in Incoterms 2000, there was a view that by 2005, we would all be using electronic messages instead of paper documents. And we were absolutely 100% wrong. That migration to e-commerce has not happened in international trade. It's happened in many other things, like banking, like shopping, and so on. But international trade is still largely reliant on paper documents. So we keep an eye on this, but in Incoterms 2010, when it was realized that this transition wasn't going to be quick, and we realized the same thing in 2020, we really condensed the wording in relation to using electronic documents instead of paper documents. And again, I'll talk more about that later. So we've kept it really simple, because the view now is, and I know we're going to be talking about this again in the 2030 review, but the view now is that the migration to e-commerce is going to be really, really slow. And there are reasons for that. I mean, just briefly, the basic reason for that is, it's all very, very well to say, okay, we're going to issue electronic messages instead of paper documents. But if the country that you're selling to doesn't recognize electronic messages instead of paper documents under their law, then you can't do it. And again, some people think it's only kind of in the developing countries where this is an issue, but it's not the case. It was only last year in the UK that we had an electronic documents bill of parliament. We weren't legally allowed to use electronic documents up till last year. And even though in the UK we do now have that Act of Parliament saying we can do it, if the countries that we're selling to can't do it because they don't have that legislation, then you've still got to use paper documents. Okay, so we always look at risk. And it's interesting because, in a way, I was going to say risk is a soft subject. Of course, it's not a soft subject, but, it's not so much a practical thing. But when we look at risk is important under Incoterms, because in each of the 11 Incoterms, we look at the risk of the seller and we look at the risk of the buyer. So we do a sanity check when there's a review of Incoterms. Has risk gone up? And we can link this with payments that we're going to talk about next week when we look at export credit control. We can't just think about the commercial risk, which is the risk that the buyer won't pay us. That's only a small element of the risk. We've got banking risk, we've got country risk, we've got sovereign risk, we've got political risk. We have to think of all those things when we're talking about an international trade. So we always look at that because that keeps our feet on the ground when we're looking at any changes we make to the terms. Would that change give more risk to the seller or to the buyer? And is that likely to be acceptable or not? Those are the kind of things that we look at. Regional groupings. There are so many regional groupings in the world now. In the Americas, you've got the US, Mexico, Canada trade agreement. Not too sure what's going to happen with that, but the agreement is kind of still there. We've got the European Union, we've got ECOWAS in West Africa, we've got ASEAN in Southeast Asia, we've got Mercosur in South America, we've got the GCC in the Middle East, and so on and so on and so on. We've got lots of these groupings. So we have to make sure that Incoterms work for trades within the groupings as much as outside them. And what I mean by that is, for example, within the European Union, the EU is a customs union. And that means that there's no import duty on most cargoes traded within the European Union. So when Incoterms covers a contract between two EU countries, under the Incoterm, traditionally it would say, depending on the term, it would say either the seller or the buyer pays import duty. But if you're trading within the EU, there's no import duty. So we simply added the words, the seller or the buyer pays import duty where applicable. Because if the trade is within a free trade area or within a customs union, or there's a trade agreement, there would be no duty payable. So you can't say seller or buyer must pay import duty. You say where applicable, because there may not be any import duty within an economic grouping. Then we have the US Commercial Code. So for our friends in the US today, you guys confuse things for us. The US has, under the American foreign trade definitions, they have a group of trade terms which look like Incoterms, they smell like Incoterms, they taste like Incoterms, they use the same acronym as Incoterms, they have a completely different meaning. Okay, and later on I'll give you one example. I'll show you the difference between FOB, US Commercial Code, and FOB Incoterm. It's a completely different meaning. Now, this is an issue. There's a reason for it, which I'll talk about. The reason is, and what I should say is that I think gradually in the USA, and you guys in the US may want to make some comments on this, gradually I think in the US, I've been seeing a migration away from the American foreign trade definitions in international contracts to using Incoterms. There is a gradual move to using Incoterms. But, for the International Chamber of Commerce, this is a big deal, to try and completely once and for all get away from the American foreign trade definitions, because it can cause confusion with trades with the USA. The reason for it is because, and you guys in the US, please correct me and please comment if you think I'm wrong, because I may be. But I think, generally when these things are discussed, what comes out of it is the US needs a set of trade terms that work for trade between states. Because, to some extent, and I've heard this from a lot of my American friends, who are in trading, and they would say to me, well, actually, when you've got a trade between two states, a lot of people in the states would look on that as being an export, even though, it's not outside the US border, because you can have different regulations in different states. It would kind of be looked upon as being an export. So because of that, the US says we need to have our own commercial code. Now, okay, that's all well and good when it's used internally within the US, but it causes confusion when it's used on contracts between the US and other countries. So, and rather unkindly, I think, whenever there's a review of Incoterms, the terminology is they always say there is a problem with the US commercial code, it causes confusion. I don't think it does cause confusion as long as there's clarity in contracts, that contracts are according to Incoterms and not the American foreign trade definitions. It's very, very easy to be clear about it. You just make sure you have the word Incoterms in the contract, and then there's no confusion. The only way you get confusion is when it doesn't state Incoterms, it doesn't state American foreign trade definitions. There's an assumption it's according to Incoterms. The trade is with the US. The party in the US thinks it's American foreign trade definitions. The party outside the US thinks it's Incoterms, and you end up with total confusion. That's what the issue is there. Then we have natural disasters. You may think, what's that got to do with Incoterms? Well, the thing, of course, is that if the contract is under a D group Incoterm, under a D group Incoterm, the seller takes all the risk until the goods are arrived and have been receipted by the buyer or by the agent of the buyer. If the goods never arrive, then they have never been legally delivered and the buyer never has to pay for them, if it's a D group Incoterm. Now, there's a big issue there. From the seller's point of view, there's always a huge risk of using a D group Incoterm. And what I think's been noticed recently, and it probably comes down to better reporting, 24-hour news the way we get it nowadays, is that, sadly, and probably because, or possibly because of climate change, there's been a lot more natural disasters than ever before. And that means using a D Incoterm is a lot more risky than it ever has been before, because of floods, because of earthquakes, because of hurricanes, because of natural disasters. So in the past couple of reviews of Incoterms, we've looked at whether we should actually be putting a really strong warning under D group Incoterms. We decided not to do that because we think actually it's up to the contracting parties to think how much risk they're prepared to take. But it's something that's always discussed. And then you get new regulations, things like the VGM regulations. Those of you who ship your metals, your materials, your minerals in containers, in shipping containers, you probably know about the relatively new, when I say relatively new, about 5 years old now, but the relatively new VGM regulation, verification of gross mass. And that means, that regulation you probably know is all about the weight of the cargo in the container. Because now, when you tell the shipping line or the freight forwarder the weight of the metal you put in the container, you're making a legal declaration. And if you get it wrong by just 1 kilo, in theory, you could be prosecuted in the international courts. It's a commitment now, it's now international law, that the weight declared to a shipping line or a freight forwarder or a carrier when cargoes are shipped by container, the weight declared must be absolutely accurate. Okay, that's a new regulation. So that's a responsibility. And we had to look at that and decide, should it be a seller's responsibility under each of the 11 terms or the buyer's responsibility? In the end, we decided it was captured in Incoterms anyway under clause A8. I'll look at the individual clauses later on. But basically, we decided that can only ever be the seller's responsibility. It can never be the buyer's responsibility for obvious reasons. But whenever there's a change like that, we really have to look at if it's going to trigger a change in the terms. So that just gives you an indication of some of the changes that we considered in the review of Incoterms. So before we go on, just shout out to me the term, just take your microphones off mute and just shout out to me the terms that you use or the terms that you've heard of. Don't be shy, just take yourselves off mute and just shout out the terms that you know.
FOB.
Thank you, FOB, yep.
In the chat there is DAP, DDP, CIF, CIP.
Okay. Any others?
CFR, let me see, there's
Yeah.
that one. DDP, DAP.
DDP, DAP, yep. Anyone else want to shout out
FCA.
some? Go on.
FCA.
FCA, great.
CIP.
CIP, brilliant. Any others? I think we're getting them all.
CPT.
CPT, very good. FAS, another one, not very much used, but FAS is another one. And I think the only one you haven't mentioned is DPU. Anyway, don't worry. I just wanted to warm you up a little bit, but we'll have a look at them individually a bit later on. So why use them? You can hear me passionately banging on about them, and I am passionate about them. So why use them? Why is it so important? And as you can see there, it's all about the word certainty. That's what it comes down to. Certainty in the contract. That's what we're trying to achieve. So what do I mean by certainty? Well, firstly, certainty, and in no particular order of priority, but certainty over who pays what in the supply chain. The biggest number of disputes you get is the buyer says to the seller, you should be paying for that. And the seller says to the buyer, no, you should be paying for that. The answer is really easy. Look it up in Incoterms. The answer will be in Article A9 or B9 for each of the terms. And that's very, very clear what the seller has to pay for and what the buyer has to pay for. No argument, it gives absolute certainty. Then certainty over the delivery point, bearing in mind, if the Incoterm begins with C, we've got two delivery points, the legal delivery point, and with the C terms, the goods are legally delivered when they're dispatched, not when they arrive, they're legally delivered when they're dispatched. But the physical delivery point is when they arrive. So we need certainty over the delivery point. And the legal delivery point will also give us certainty at the point of risk transfer from the seller to the buyer. So where does the seller's risk end and where does the buyer's risk start? And there's no gap between them. There's no grey area. There's no gap. Where the seller's risk ends, the buyer's risk begins. So we'll have certainty over the point of risk transfer. It gives us certainty over the responsibilities of the seller and the buyer. In the supply chain, what does the seller have to do and what does the buyer have to do? Because the problem is, we may think the other party is doing it. Who's going to arrange import clearance? We may think, well, the importer's going to do that. But under DDP, that's not the case. So that's just one example. So we need to know who's going to do things. So we get certainty over the responsibilities of the parties. What does the seller have to do and what does the buyer have to do? There are two Incoterms which make insurance compulsory. And the clue is in the I. If the Incoterm's got an I in it, that means it is compulsory to insure the cargo. And those are CIP and CIF. And under Incoterms, we get certainty over the level of cover that has to be provided. We'll look at that later on. So certainty over the minimum insurance cover. Remembering from yesterday that in international trade, the documents represent the goods. So we need to have certainty over when the documents should be passed from the seller to the buyer. Because if the buyer can't get the documents, they can't get the goods. And finally, if it all goes horribly wrong, then we have access to the International Chamber of Commerce Court of Arbitration in the event of a dispute. Now, let me just say a little bit about that. I sat on the Court of Arbitration for a few years, and I can tell you a bit of a story there. The Court of Arbitration, the ICC Court of Arbitration, it's, the thing is, if you've got a dispute, a contractual dispute with your counterparty, you could go to a lawyer, you could go to a national court. It's going to be really expensive. It's going to take a long time to come to a decision. So the International Chamber of Commerce have a Court of Arbitration. And the Court of Arbitration, one of the major things that they look at is implementation or disputes concerning International Chamber of Commerce rules. And the principal set of International Chamber of Commerce rules are, of course, Incoterms. So for a few years, I got a role, and this is a part-time role, on the Court of Arbitration. There are several panels, and I was on one of the panels. And when I was being briefed on the work, I was told that, what happens is there's a contractual dispute between a seller and a buyer. You will be given copies of all the documentation, the contract, and what the dispute is. And then the panel, and I think there were 5 or 6 of us on each panel, and then the panel will discuss it, we'll look at it, and we'll come to a conclusion. And I couldn't really understand it initially, but we were given the briefing on our role in the Court of Arbitration. And at the end of it, the guy who was training us, he basically said, well, very, very often the dispute is heard remotely. But he said, if the parties do want to come to ICC in Paris to have the review heard face to face, and quite a lot of respondents did, if they do want to do that, we do it face to face. And what we were told is if it is a face to face hearing, we should make the hearing last at least 45 minutes. That was the guidance we were given. Make it last at least 45 minutes. And I really didn't understand what the relevance of that was until I started doing it. And then when I started doing it, what I quickly, and other people I think quickly discovered was, actually, this should never have come to the Court of Arbitration. Because all the parties had to do was look at the book, and the answer would be in the book. That's all they had to do. So coming to the Court of Arbitration was really unnecessary, because if they had only got the book and referred to it, the answer would have been there. But because they have to pay to use the Court of Arbitration, we were told make the hearing last at least 45 minutes, so they think they're getting good value for money. I found that quite amusing, but in a way upsetting at the time as well. Okay, so these are the reasons why to use them. And remember, key takeaways so far, or 2 key takeaways, there are loads of them, but 2 key things, is that firstly, do remember that Incoterms govern the contract of sale, not the contract of carriage. They impact on the contract of carriage, but they govern the contract of sale. That's the first key takeaway. The second key takeaway is you can do it if you like. I was going to say, do not Google Incoterms and think you'll get a correct response. There is the biggest load of rubbish on the internet about Incoterms. The only true source is the International Chamber of Commerce. You need to get the book. You can get it in paper format, you can get it virtually from the International Chamber of Commerce. You can actually get a free of charge app, which isn't the full Incoterms. It's a kind of introduction, but there is a free app available, which gives a kind of very, very brief view. But, anyone involved in international trade, you need that book, whether you get it virtually or the paper version. The only true source of Incoterms is the book. And, as I've mentioned, sadly, many organizations do put Incoterms on their website, even government organizations. As I mentioned, the biggest shipping line in the world, and they should get it right, have got Incoterms wrong on their website. It's a very, very big issue. Now, in Incoterms 2020, for those of you who've got the book, you'll know, but there's actually a new section in it. And the new section covers what Incoterms don't deal with. And that's an innovation in Incoterms 2020. And the reason that's there is because there is so much misinformation about Incoterms. So if you look at Incoterms 2020, you will see there's a short chapter on what Incoterms don't deal with to make sure some of the myths about Incoterms can be completely removed. So firstly, they don't deal with whether a contract exists or not, because they don't know. You can do that. And of course, they can't deal with the specification of the goods for every single product traded. They can't do that. What they do is say that the correct product must be sold. And we'll look at that a bit later on. They don't dictate the time, place, method, or currency of payment. But as I've mentioned earlier, they can have an impact on payment in relation to when an exporter recognizes revenue for a sale. Okay, and they also have to work in terms of document handover from seller to buyer when the documents go to the banking system, for example, with a letter of credit. So, and I've mentioned earlier on, there is a big change in Incoterms 2020, which we'll look at later on. They can't cover remedies for breach of contract because that's going to be different depending on the legislation of the countries concerned. They don't cover most consequences of delay or other breaches of obligation. They can't cover the effect of sanctions. Of course they can't. You wouldn't expect that. Or the imposition of tariffs, very importantly with the situation we have at the moment. And I think, and I think the whole point is that when you see how quickly tariffs have been brought in, against the international global rules, that's the kind of reason why Incoterms cannot cover the imposition of tariffs. They can't cover export or import prohibitions and restrictions because, again, every country has the sovereign right to have import and export restrictions. Every country has the right to do that. They don't cover force majeure or hardship. And that's quite interesting because after COVID, this came up a lot where, I had lots of queries from traders saying, why don't Incoterms cover force majeure? Because we were in a position during COVID where we couldn't perform the contract. So, of course, COVID came in after Incoterms 2020. COVID happened in, the lockdown started in most countries around about March 2020. Whereas, of course, Incoterms 2020 came in January 2020. So they didn't cover pandemics. Now, there's a big, and I'm sure we're going to have this discussion for Incoterms 2030. There will be a discussion about whether Incoterms should cover force majeure in the event of something like a pandemic. My personal view is they can't and they won't. I shouldn't preempt that because I'm very open to listening to the discussions. But certainly that's my view at the moment, that the way Incoterms work, they couldn't cover those things. But we'll see. We'll see. There will be a debate on that. Yeah, do we have a question? I can see the initials GO trying to talk. No, okay.
I have a question about force majeure. It seems so. If the seller is responsible for if it is the seller's liability, so say they are under the D group Incoterms. But the force majeure can still impact them. So it might not be their fault. It could be a natural disaster.
Yeah.
It could be anything. Would it not be sensible for Incoterms to cover to either cover force majeure, or could you explain a bit the relationship between Incoterms and force majeure if such an incident happens?
Sure.
So force majeure, to explain, is a term that people can use when they're affected by something they could not foresee, an unforeseeable risk, such as a natural disaster. It could be a war or a revolution. These things come under rule of force majeure that someone can claim for non-performance of contract.
Yeah, thanks, Paulina. Really good point. And the simple answer to that is the issue with that, because it does make sense, doesn't it? The issue there is what is considered to be a force majeure event is different in different countries. That's why it can't cover it. Because, Incoterms can't cover things which can vary from country to country to country. It just wouldn't work. The Incoterms book would be 5,000 pages long because it would have to have legislation from every country. So you couldn't do that. It just wouldn't work. Now, when we did the last review of Incoterms, and this was, and as I've mentioned, COVID did actually bring this to light. And what we did do is we asked the lawyers to have a look at that and say, this is our thinking at the moment, that because legislation is going to be different in different countries, it's going to be really different to incorporate within Incoterms. And, eventually, and they discussed this, the lawyers agreed that. They said you couldn't do that because there would just be too many variations you could have. But I guess, and I'm sure it will be discussed again. I've got no doubt, and it should be discussed again. It really should be. But what it really needs is an international definition of a force majeure event. That's what's needed. And currently, we haven't got that. They talk about something that you couldn't reasonably foresee, but that's interpreted, I just made up that word. It's interpreted in different ways in different countries. So you have a really big issue with that. So until we get an international definition of force majeure, I think it's going to be really difficult to incorporate it. That's the background.
But an Incoterm does not preclude someone from declaring a force majeure if that force majeure is recognized in the jurisdiction under which they're delivering their contract.
Absolutely. And, it's something that should be under jurisdiction. It's something that should be in their contract. Just because it's not covered by Incoterms, it can still be in the contract. So having a force majeure in a contract, nowadays, I think particularly, is probably a very, very good thing to do. It really is a good thing to do. So absolutely, Polina, separate clause in the contract, that's absolutely fine, but it's not incorporated within the Incoterm governing the contract.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
Brilliant. Thank you. Really good point. Thanks. Intellectual property rights, again, because of different rules in different countries, and again, because it doesn't really, I was going to say it doesn't matter, it's not the right terminology, but, in terms of intellectual property rights, again, that's a legal matter, that should be in the contract, but it's not covered by Incoterms. The method, venue, or law of dispute is going to be by negotiation between the parties. So the jurisdiction contract, yesterday we looked at the content of the contract, there will be a jurisdiction clause, and that's going to show the method, venue, and law of dispute. That will be something negotiated between the parties. And finally, the reason why it's in red is because this is where there's the biggest misconception. Incoterms don't deal with the ownership of the goods. They don't deal with the transfer of property or title. In other words, the transfer of ownership from the seller to the buyer. They can't deal with that. They deal with where the risk passes, and they deal with where the goods are legally delivered, but they don't deal with the transfer of ownership. Again, that's going to be a separate clause in the contract. And very, very often, that's going to be linked with payment. That's normally what's going to happen. Very often, it's very, very usual that you'll see a retention of title clause in the contract that will say something like ownership of the goods will stay with the exporter, with the seller, until the goods have been fully paid for. So that would be a typical retention of title clause you'd see in the contract. But it's a really important issue. Incoterms do not govern the transfer of property because where the risk passes from the seller to the buyer, some people think that's where ownership passes, but it doesn't unless the contract allows for that. Okay, so, it sounds like a small thing. Well, maybe it doesn't even sound like a small thing. It's actually quite a big thing. The transfer of ownership is not covered by Incoterms. There's probably going to be a retention of title clause in the contract. It will be covered by a separate clause in the contract. So when we look at the international supply chain, the key thing is there are lots of critical points in the supply chain, even in the most simple supply chain. And there's an example on the screen at the moment. You've got the movement of goods from the seller to the buyer, and you've got all these critical points, 12 or 13 critical points in between. And the key thing here is, don't worry about the individual points, but the point here that I'm making is that at each critical point, and this is a simple supply chain, a very, very simple supply chain, but even in the most simple supply chain, you can have 12 or 13 critical points. At each critical point, something's going to happen. There's going to be an activity, customs clearance, loading a truck, loading a ship, offloading an aircraft, providing documents, weighing the cargo. There's going to be an activity. And for each activity, we need to know which party has the cost of it, the seller or the buyer. Which party has the responsibility for doing it, the seller or the buyer? And if the goods are damaged during the activity, who has the risk, the seller or the buyer? So basically, that's what Incoterms are doing. They're looking at every single part of the supply chain, and they're looking at the division of risk, obligation, and cost between seller and buyer for each of the 11 terms for each possible activity within a supply chain. Now, Incoterms don't list all the activities because there can be hundreds of them in the complex supply chain, but they tell you where the seller has the risk and the responsibility and where that risk ends, and when the buyer has it and where the risk ends. So we end up with 4 groups of Incoterms, and the groups are designated by the first letter of the term. Okay, so we've got 11 terms, and those terms are subdivided into 4 groups. And each group has a quality about that group. So the first group is Group E. And Group E is very, very straightforward. There's only one Incoterm in Group E. And as I mentioned, we'll look at all the terms individually a bit later on. There's only one Incoterm in Group E, and that's Ex-Works or EXW. Remembering every Incoterm is a 3-letter acronym. So there's only one of them in Group E, Ex-Works or EXW. In the Group E term, the goods are made available to the buyer at the seller's premises. Simple as that. Okay, and remember, the Group E terms are not export terms, they're domestic terms. If you sell under a Group E term, EXW, you are not exporting. You're doing a domestic sale. Okay, EXW, Ex-Works, is not for international trade. Even though people try and use it for international trade, it causes problems. It's not designed for international trade. So that's Group E. In Group F, we have 3 terms, FOB, FAS, and FCA. And with the Group F terms, the seller delivers the cargo to a carrier by sea, by air, by road, by rail, or to a freight forwarder. But the carrier is appointed, contracted, and paid for by the buyer. So with the F group,
John, repeat the 3. John, repeat the 3,
Sure.
please.
Sure. FOB, FAS, and FCA. FOB, we'll look at all the individual
Sorry, again, please. Again, please.
FOB, FAS, and FCA.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so F group, the seller delivers the goods to a carrier appointed by the buyer. The buyer holds the contract of carriage. Okay, and the risk passes from seller to buyer on dispatch. So the F group terms are generally used when the buyer can get a better freight rate than the seller. That's a bit of a generalization, but it normally holds true. So later on, we'll look at which term to use in different circumstances. But with F group, that's the normal environment. The F group terms will normally be used if the buyer can get a better freight rate than the seller. We then have C group, and there are 4 Incoterms in the C group: CPT, CIP, CFR, and CIF. And the C group terms are very, very similar to F group. The only difference between them is that with the C group terms, the seller arranges, contracts, and pays for the international transportation, but doesn't take the risk of the international transportation. So the only difference between C group and F group is that with the C group, the seller has the contract of carriage, but does not have the risk of carriage. Okay, so the C group terms would normally be used where the seller can get a better freight rate than the buyer. That's normally when the C group terms would be used. But in terms of risk, there is no difference between F group and C group. Risk passes at exactly the same point on dispatch. And with both F group and C group, the goods are legally delivered on dispatch, not on arrival. In terms of legal delivery, F group and C group are identical. The goods are legally delivered when they're dispatched, not when they arrive. We then finally have the D group terms. With the D group terms, and there are three of them, DAP, DPU, and DDP. Those are the three. And with the D group terms, the seller takes all the cost and all the risk required to bring the goods to the place of destination. The seller holds the contract of carriage, and risk only passes from seller to buyer when the goods have arrived at the agreed destination and been receipted by the buyer or by the agent of the buyer. Okay, so with the D group terms, the seller takes all the risk until the receipted arrival of the goods. So with E group, F group, and C group terms, the seller's risk ends on dispatch. But things change considerably when we get to D group. With the D group, the seller's risk ends only when the goods have arrived at final destination and been receipted by the buyer. If they never arrive, or if they do arrive but they haven't been receipted, they have not been legally delivered, and the seller is not entitled to get paid. Okay, so those are the four groups, E, F, C, and D. Any questions on that?
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Currently on discussions on DAP, seller is asking to pay at the dispatch on DAP conditions, while he would like to keep the contract of carriage and to all risks which will be done until the delivery. The only thing what is quite unusual for me is the payment at the dispatch.
Yeah.
Could you give me some comments on that and your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you for asking. With DAP, the goods have not been legally delivered until they arrive at destination. So a sensible buyer, if I'm buying from you DAP, I would say I'm not going to give you 1 cent until the goods arrive because you haven't performed the contract of sale until the goods arrive. So if I am a buyer who really understands Incoterms, I'm going to say you're not going to get paid until the goods arrive. Because until they arrive, you haven't legally delivered, and therefore you're not entitled to get paid. Do you see what I mean? So if from the seller's point of view, if the buyer is prepared to pay before the goods arrive, if the buyer's prepared to take that risk, that's entirely up to them. And they may well do, or they may not may well do, so they may do that. They may do it. But the point is, a buyer who's well trained in procurement, they would say to the seller, look, really, really sorry, but you've got the risk until arrival. Okay, that's why we've asked for a D term rather than a C term. We want you to have the risk until arrival. You don't legally deliver until the goods have arrived, until we've got them. So we will pay you when we've got them, but we're not going to pay you before that, because how do we know that you're going to perform the contract of sale? That's what a sensible procurement person would say. But as I say, it may be that they won't even know that, or it may be you can negotiate out of that. It may be the seller can negotiate and say, well, look, at least give us 50% on dispatch. We accept that you don't have to give us the rest until arrival. At least negotiate that. So, frankly, that would all be down to negotiation.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
You're
this
welcome.
is kind of confirmation for my
Yeah.
doubt. So,
Does that answer your point?
yeah, yeah.
And I think it's a really good point. And, in practical terms, honestly, most buyers aren't aware that, in law, they would be protected if they insist on not paying until arrival. In law, they would be protected under the Incoterm. Very many buyers don't know that. So, if you're a seller and they're prepared to pay on dispatch, that's great. Let them do it. That's great if they're prepared to have that risk. So thanks for asking. That's a really good point. Okay, so we are absolutely, I think, according to my watch, bang on 2:30 UK time, which is the ideal point to have a pause. After the pause, we're going to look at the individual terms one by one. You'll appreciate in the time available, we haven't got time to go to all the details of the 11 terms, but I'll give you an overview of each of the 11 terms after the break. So, just before we break, any questions so far? Okay, so let's have the break now. We'll please reconvene in 30 minutes. That will be UK time 3 o'clock. UK is UTC +1. So wherever you are, if we could please reconvene in 30 minutes, that would be great. Thank you very much for your attention so far.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone in the seminar. If for any reason during the break you drop out, please drop me an email and I'll send you again the link and you can log back in. Thank you. See you in half an hour.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed a refreshing break, ready for the next stage of Incoterms. So what we're going to do now is look at the 11 terms, just a quick overview of each of the terms. So we start off with 7 terms that you can use for any mode of transport. And when I say any mode of transport, I mean road, rail,
John,
air.
can I interrupt you? Can I interrupt you, John?
Please.
Is it possible to put on the screen again the group 5 picture that you had on the screen earlier? Is
Group,
that possible or is that a problem?
sorry, which group?
The F.
There we go.
Okay, wait, bear with me a second while I just wanted to take a shot of it. Bear with me a second, please. Oh, okay.
Is that okay? Do you have it?
I think I goofed, but never mind. Maybe. Oh no, I have it now. Amy.
Okay. I mean,
bear with me a second.
Sure, but do bear in mind that at the end today, Paulina will be sending out copies of the slides from yesterday and today.
Oh, okay, good.
So you'll get
Thank you.
Okay. So 7 rules, 7 Incoterms for any mode of transport. So any mode means road, rail, sea, containerized sea freight, or air freight. So these rules are for anything other than bulk sea freight. They're for container sea freight, for road, for rail, for air, or for any mixture of those modes of transport. And these are the rules. So to take them briefly one by one, EXW XWorks. So with XWorks, virtually all the responsibility is with the buyer. So the seller is treating the contract as a domestic sale. So the buyer has to come and collect the goods. And when the buyer collects the goods, they even have to load their own truck. The seller must not load the collecting truck. The buyer, because the seller is treating it as a domestic sale, the buyer must also arrange export customs clearance and export import clearance when the goods arrive at destination. So with XWorks, the seller is not an exporter. The buyer is the exporter of record and the importer of record. Because of that, with XWorks, because the seller is treating it like a domestic sale, it is a domestic sale from the exporter's point of view, from the seller's point of view, they have to charge tax. If there's a local tax like VAT, GST, then the seller has to include that tax in their selling price because the seller is not the exporter. So that's XWorks, which never works very well for export. Any questions on that? Okay, so we then have FCA free carrier. The seller delivers the goods, or the goods are collected from the seller by a carrier appointed by the buyer. So the buyer holds the contract of carriage. All the seller is doing is delivering the goods to the carrier which is appointed, contracted, and paid for by the buyer. Under FCA, the seller does carry out export customs clearance. Okay, so under FCA, the seller is the exporter of record. So in fact, when companies say to me, oh, we use XWorks, probably we shouldn't be doing that. A really good alternative is to use FCA instead of XWorks. So FCA free carrier. So then we come on to some C group terms, CPT and CIP. CPT, carriage paid to a point agreed in the country of arrival, in the country of destination. So the seller has the contract of carriage to get the cargo to the agreed destination point. It may be a port, an airport, a railway station, a factory, a warehouse, a house, a field, anywhere which has been agreed in the country of arrival. With CPT, the seller's risk ends in exactly the same place as FCA. So with CPT, the seller's risk ends when the seller hands the goods to the carrier. So if it's a container load of cargo, when the seller loads that container, that's where their risk ends, even though they've got to get the cargo to the agreed arrival point. So the only difference between FCA and CPT is that with CPT, the seller has the contract of carriage up to the agreed arrival point. But with FCA and CPT, the seller's risk ends and legal delivery takes place on dispatch, not on arrival, on dispatch. So legal delivery under FCA and CPT is exactly the same place, as it is with CIP. The only difference between CPT and CIP is that with CIP, the seller must also insure the cargo. So CIP, carriage and insurance paid too. Now, this is interesting, and I want you to think about this. So I've said with CIP, the seller arranges insurance. Okay, so say the goods are going to, where should we pick? Let's say they're going to Singapore City. The terms are CIP, Incoterms 2020, Singapore City. So the seller has to arrange and contract the transport up to Singapore City. They also have to insure the cargo up to Singapore City because CIP includes insurance. But where does their risk end with CIP? Who can tell me that? Where does the seller's risk end?
The dispatch.
Sorry?
It's the dispatch of materials, so the risk transfer to the seller, right? To the buyer.
I'm sorry, you're not coming across very clearly.
The risks are transferred from seller to buyer at the dispatch. Is what you wanted to ask?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very clearly.
Mihail said the risk transfers from seller to buyer at dispatch.
Okay, great, which is absolutely right. Thanks, Mihail. Sorry, I couldn't hear you very clearly. So, absolutely right. The risk passes on dispatch. In that case, why is the seller insuring up to arrival if the risk passes on dispatch? We seem to have a mismatch there. You're absolutely right, Mikhail, in what you're saying. The risk does end on dispatch. The seller legally delivers on dispatch. So why would they be insuring? Anyone got a view on that? It seems strange, doesn't it? Their risk ends on dispatch. Why are they insuring the goods up to arrival? Because they don't have the risk up to arrival. Why would they be insuring? As you can see, there's a bit of a mismatch there, isn't there? Anyone got a view on that?
That because there can be several theories.
I didn't catch that. Polina, did you manage to catch that?
No, Mihail, sorry, your sound is a little bit blurry. You can type it, I can read it out. Or please repeat it again.
Or anyone else? Anyone else got a view on that?
Sorry, do you hear me now?
Oh, that's better. That's much better, Mihail. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I had to change my headset.
No trouble at all. You're very clear.
Yeah,
now.
so perhaps is that because of many carriage transport companies can be used for transport?
But why would the
I
seller
don't know.
insure? Yeah, You see, it's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? It's a bit of a strange situation. We're saying here that the seller's risk, you're quite absolutely right in what you said. The seller's risk ends on dispatch. So say it's a container load of goods. As soon as the seller loads that container, their risk ends. They've legally delivered when they load that container at their warehouse. That's where they've legally delivered. So why would they insure up to arrival? I'll tell you the answer. The reason is they're insuring the goods on behalf of the buyer and against the buyer's risk. So they load the container, say the goods are going from New York to Singapore City. The terms are CIP Singapore City, and it's a container load of metal. So when the seller loads that container at their warehouse in New York, that's where they have legally delivered. That's where their risk ends. So they load the metal into the container. The truck drives away from their warehouse in New York towards the port. As it's driving away, it overturns, the container falls off, all the cargo is damaged. Okay, that's the buyer's risk. It's not the seller's risk. The seller's risk ended when they loaded the container, when they handed it to the carrier. That's the buyer's risk. So the buyer would still have to pay the seller because the buyer has the risk. But then the buyer would make a claim on the insurance company. So with CIP, the seller is insuring the cargo on behalf of the buyer and against the buyer's risk. Okay, the seller isn't insuring the cargo for their own risk because they haven't got the risk. Then they're insuring on behalf of the buyer. Okay, so, it's a little bit tricky, isn't it, to get your head around, but that's the way it works.
John, Joshua at Lipman Walton suggested that it is because the seller is organizing the carriage.
No, nothing to do with
the
it.
buyer, no. Okay.
No, nothing to do with it. It doesn't matter, and I can see where you're coming from on that, Josh. It makes sense what you're saying, but that's, it's not the way it works. The buyer's got the risk. Okay, so the seller is purely insuring on behalf of the buyer. The buyer would have to make the insurance claim. So with CPT and CIP, it's very, very clear. The seller legally delivers in exactly the same place as FCA when they hand the goods to the first carrier in the country of dispatch. That's where they have legally delivered, even though they've got to get the cargo up to destination with CPT and CIP. So under CIP, the seller is insuring the cargo on behalf of the buyer and against the buyer's risk. And again, it may come down.
John, can I ask you a question here?
Of course you can. Please go ahead.
Which is the preferred choice or the most common choice out of these terms that are often used?
Okay. If I may, Freya, we're going to talk about that later on, which one to use.
Oh, okay.
Because it's a kind of, it's a matrix of decision making. There's a number of things you have to take into account, which will drive you or which will lead you into using an appropriate term. So if it's okay with you, can we handle that later on where we will cover that?
Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay. So far we've looked at the terms where delivery occurs on dispatch. So with EXW, FCA, CPT, CIP, legal delivery is on dispatch, even though with CPT and CIP, physical delivery is up to the point of arrival. Okay, now we get to the D terms, and this is where it changes in a very, very big way. Because with the D terms, the seller takes all the risk until the goods arrive. And the seller doesn't legally deliver until the goods arrive at the agreed destination and have been receipted by the buyer. And there are three terms in the D group. DAP, delivered at place, exactly as it sounds. The seller must deliver the goods and take all the risk until they arrive at the agreed delivery point in the place of arrival. The seller has not legally delivered the goods until they do arrive and until they've been receipted. So if they arrive at the place of arrival, but no one's receipted them, they have not been legally delivered. So DAP, delivered at place. DPU is a slight extension of that, delivered at place unloaded. And as unrealistic as it may sound, with DPU, the seller also has the responsibility to unload the goods when they arrive at the agreed destination. Now, you may say, how could the seller do that? A typical situation where that would be used would be a situation where you've got a container load of product and it's a very, very sophisticated load. The seller knows how they loaded the container at origin. They know how they've loaded it. They know how they've secured the cargo. So it makes sense for the seller to unload it in a safe way when the goods arrive. That's the kind of environment where DPU would be used quite a lot by the Japanese trading houses when they're trading in sophisticated pieces of machinery. So not used very much, but it's purely an extension of DAP. DPU, the only difference between DAP and DPU is that with DPU, the seller is also responsible for taking the cost, the risk, and the obligation for unloading the goods when they arrive. That's the only difference between DAP and DPU. And for those of you who remember the term DAT from Incoterms 2010, DPU is purely a change in acronym. The meaning of the term, or the definition of the term, is exactly the same as DAT. When we did the 2020 review, it became very, very clear that people didn't really understand DAT, delivered at terminal. They thought terminal meant it's got to be a transport terminal, a port, an airport, a railway station, where in fact terminal actually meant the terminal delivery point, the final delivery point. But it wasn't clearly understood. So DPU is just to make it clearer what that term means. It's purely a change in acronym from Incoterms 2010. It replaces DAT. So DPU, delivered at place, unloaded. And then finally, we have DDP, delivered, duty paid. And as you can see there's another version of DDP, deadly, dangerous practice for the exporter. And I'm talking to loads, or I'm trying to sort out issues for many, many exporters at the moment who have sold from outside the USA to the USA, and suddenly there's a tariff, which they weren't expecting at the time of the contract. So when they contracted with the buyer, they agreed a DDP price, delivered, duty paid. Then it comes to shipping the goods now, and the price has gone up considerably because the tariff's gone up. Okay, and the buyer has the right to say, no, we've signed a contract at the original price. We're not paying the higher price because of the higher tariff. So lots of confusion at the moment. DDP is very, very dangerous for the exporter. With DDP, the exporter is the exporter of record from their country and the importer of record in the country they're selling to. So with DDP, the seller has to customs clear the goods when they arrive at destination and also pay the import duty when the goods arrive at destination. That's got to be incorporated into the selling price. So if the duty goes up, then the seller is going to have increased exposure. Okay, they're going to be subject to a higher cost than they appreciated. And globally, tens of thousands, well, I shouldn't exaggerate this, let's say thousands of exporters to the US have come across this. They signed contracts before the tariffs came in, at a price before the tariffs came in, fixed price DDP contracts with buyers in the States. And they're shipping the goods now. And of course, suddenly they're subject to higher tariffs, which they're going to have to pay. And that's going to completely erode their margins in many cases. So I think the current situation, really, DDP has always been dangerous. I think the current situation highlights the danger of DDP for the seller. So, when we talk to exporters, we would always say DDP, delivered, duty paid, deadly, dangerous practice. Not just because tariffs may go up, but also because you're subject to the law of another country. If you sell DDP, you're the exporter of record from your country and the importer of record in the country you're selling to. So if we go back to Singapore, you're selling DDP Singapore City, That makes you and you're selling from the US, that would make you exporter of record from the US and importer of record in Singapore. And that means for your export, you're subject to US law. For the import, you're subject to the Singapore Customs Code. And if you breach the code, you could get prosecuted in the Singapore courts. So DDP, very, very dangerous for the seller. Okay, so those 7 terms are the 7 terms that you would use for container sea freight, road freight, rail freight, air freight, or any mixture of those modes of transport. Any questions on those?
John, just for clarification, DAP
Yeah.
and DPU don't involve customs clearance by the seller. It is the
No,
buyer who does
exactly.
customs clearance.
Exactly.
So the duties are with the buyer, not with the seller.
With DAP and DPU, yeah, they are. They are. And, you know, in itself, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Thanks very much, Paulina, because, you know, therein lies a problem as well. Because with DAP and DPU, very, very often delivery is going to be to an inland point. That's very normal. So if you've got, for example, DAP Singapore City, that means the seller has got to get the goods to the agreed address in Singapore City. In other words, they've got to get the goods past the point of entry, Singapore port. They've got to get them to Singapore City. Now, the seller isn't responsible for customs clearance. The buyer's responsible under DAP and DPU. So when the goods arrive at Singapore port, the buyer's got to arrange the clearance and pay the duty before the seller can complete their obligation to deliver to Singapore City. And that can cause very, very big confusion and delays. If the buyer delays in customs clearance, you can get a situation where the seller is subject to demurrage at the port because the cargo's been delayed. Now, Incoterms actually cover that, and they do say that if the buyer delays in customs clearance, they have to pay any accrued charges that are attributed to that delay. But it does get very, very messy. It really does. But absolutely right, Paulina, that's the situation with DAP and DPU. The seller is responsible for import customs, sorry, the buyer is responsible for import customs clearance. Sorry, my phone's just. DDP is the only Incoterm where the seller is responsible for import clearance and import duties. No other Incoterm apart from DDP. So thanks for asking that, Paulina. Really good point. Any other questions on that or comments? Okay, so we then have 4 terms which you can only use for bulk sea freight. If the goods are loaded in containers, you cannot use these terms. So this is only for break bulk, the old-fashioned way of shipping goods. You know, if you're dealing with 5,000 tons of ore, then you're probably using a bulk ship. That's the kind of environment when you can use these terms. But I stress, you can't use the next 4 terms when the goods are loaded in containers. And that's FAS, FOB, CFR, CIF. Those are only for bulk maritime, not for container. So what have we got? FAS, free alongside ship, exactly as it sounds. The seller legally delivers the goods alongside the ship at the port of loading, and that's where their responsibility ends. They have to carry out export customs clearance. They have to deliver alongside the ship. So for FAS to work, and actually for FOB to work, the ship must be there. It must be in place when the cargo is being delivered. So with FAS, the seller delivers the goods, customs cleared for export, alongside the ship at the port of loading. With FOB, it's purely an extension of FAS. With FOB, the seller must deliver the goods on board the ship, not just alongside it, but actually onto the deck of the ship. Under FOB, legal delivery is when the cargo touches the deck of the ship. That's where the goods are legally delivered from the seller to the buyer. CFR, cost and freight, is exactly the same as FOB, well, not exactly, is nearly the same as FOB with a slight extension. The only extension is with CFR, the seller also arranges the contract of carriage up to the port of arrival. So with CFR, the seller arranges the international sea freight up to the port of arrival. But with CFR, legal delivery is exactly the same place as FOB. The cargo is legally delivered when it's loaded on board the ship. It used to be when it crossed the ship's rail. That was the case until 2010. But from 2010 onwards, under Incoterms, it's when the goods are on the ship. That's when they've been legally delivered under CFR. And just like CIP is to CPT, CIF is purely an extension of CFR. The only difference is with CIF, the seller also insures the goods. And just like with CIP, they're insuring them against the buyer's risk and on behalf of the buyer, or the other way around, on behalf of the buyer and against the buyer's risk. And the key point there is those terms can only use for bulk cargoes, the old-fashioned way of shipping, as you can see in the picture there, when the goods are loaded directly onto the deck of the ship without containers. If the goods are loaded in containers, you can't use FOB, FAS, CFR, and CIF. You can't use those four terms for container shipments. Okay, let me pause there. Any questions or comments?
A little bit puzzled.
Go on. Let's see if we can unpuzzle you.
The matter is that CIP usually, what I have heard from my practice, I mean, used by many companies as delivery, cost insurance and freight as well, but by land. Okay, CIF even today, so still people quote for container delivered by sea. That's all. So that is why I can understand that nowadays that if I receive the material in container,
yes,
kind of in usually proposed to me as CIF Rotterdam.
Yeah.
So I need to precise to people know it's CIP Rotterdam. Am I right?
You are right. You're absolutely right. And right at the end this afternoon, I'm going to show you a case study of what can happen if the wrong term is used. But you're absolutely right. You know, it's a big problem globally. And normally when I get to this stage in the presentation, loads of people jump up and say, we always use CIF for everything. I hear this a lot. It's absolutely the wrong thing to do. And it's a global issue. With the misuse of FOB, FAS, CFR, CIF, it is a global issue. And, you know, it's quite funny at times. Even when, you know, I mentioned a bit earlier on, I was talking at the Automotive Industry Annual Conference a few months back. And, you know, it wasn't really about Incoterms, but this came up. And it was an audience. There were about, I don't know, at the conference, probably about 300 people. It was in Dubai. I can't remember. There's a few conferences. It was in Dubai, I think. But anyway, I mentioned this, that one of the key problems at the moment in international supply chains is that the wrong terms are being used. And sometimes insurance companies are saying the insurance is not valid because you've used an inappropriate term. So this came up in the talk I was giving about supply chain disruption. And someone jumped up in the audience and said, "You're wrong. We always use CIF." And I had to explain very gently. I said, well, you know, really sorry, but, you know, it's a wrong term to use if the goods are in containers. And then the guy, and, you know, he was given the microphone so that he could make the point. And then the guy said, but, you know, we always do this. This must be something new in Incoterms 2020, that we can't use CIF if the goods are in containers. And I had to say to him, no, this was new in 1980. That's when it was new, when it was discovered, you know, by the ICC in the 1980 review that CIF, FOB, CFR, FAS don't work if the goods are in containers. And, you know, there are good reasons for this. You know, I always believe in giving reasons. So it's not just me saying this, it's what the rules say, but there's a very, very good reason. And the reason is, you know, if we look at the pictures for a minute, there's a really big difference between this kind of shipping and the way it's performed and this kind. And basically, there are two big differences. So with this kind of shipping, firstly, the first point at which the ship owner takes an interest in the cargo is when the cargo is on the ship. They have no interest in the cargo before that. But with this kind of shipping, container shipping, those containers you can see on the ship would have been loaded inland. Someone would have contacted the shipping line and said, please position one empty 20-foot container at my warehouse in New York City to load ore. Okay, so the shipping line position a container inland where the cargo is loaded into the container. And that means the shipping line have an interest in the cargo way, way before they do for a bulk cargo. With a bulk cargo, there's no interest until the cargo's on the ship. With a container cargo, the shipping line take an interest much, much earlier in the supply chain. That's the first big difference. The second big difference, with bulk cargo, if the master of the ship, the captain of the ship, wants to count the cargo going onto the ship, they can do it. There's visibility of the cargo. They can see the cargo going onto the ship. With container shipments, the captain of the ship has no visibility of the cargo. All they know is that there's a 20-foot or 40-foot container or 45-foot container being loaded onto the ship. They have no idea what's in that container. They know what's been declared, but they don't know what's in the container. And that's why, for those of you who ship goods by container, if you look at a shipping line bill of lading for a container shipment, it would never say 1 20-foot container of metal. It won't say that. It would say 1 20-foot container said to contain metal or said to be metal, because the shipping line have no idea what's in the container. So with those two things, you can see there's a huge operational difference between shipping the goods by container and shipping them by conventional bulk ship. And that's why we have to have different terms for container shipments and for bulk shipments, because you can't use the same terms. It doesn't work. And that became the case from 1980 onwards. So, you know, at that particular conference, this guy in the audience, he said, no, that must be something new in Incoterms 2020. And as I mentioned, I had to very gently say to him, you know, I tried to be as gentle as I could because there was a lot of people in the room. So as gently as I could, I said, well, you know, actually, it was new in 1980 when containerization came in fully. It wasn't, you know, it's not something that's new. It was new for over 40 years ago, 45 years ago. That's when it was new. But it's still a problem. People are still using FOB, FAS, CFR, and CIF when they shouldn't be using those terms. And there are dangers in doing that, which I'll give you an example of later on.
John, from Joshua, he said that in the Incoterms 2020 book,
Yeah.
he didn't see under the Incoterms that SIF is not acceptable for containerized goods. So there is the biggest difference is that SIF is for multimodal and
Okay.
requires more stringent insurance than SIF, but it doesn't state outright that SIF is not suitable for
I will
container.
give you the page number if I can find it quickly. Sorry, forgive me. Oh, sorry, that's FAS. So you were talking about CIF, yep. Let's see if I can find this quickly. Okay, so if you've got the English version of Incoterms, if you look on page 123, mode of transport, CIF, this all is to be used only for sea or inland waterway transport where more than one mode of transport is to be used. For example, sorry, I'm reading this word for word. Yeah, so when more than one mode of transport is to be used, which will commonly be the case where goods are handed over to a carrier at a container terminal, the appropriate rule to use is CIP, not CIF. So you'll find that on page 123.
I find from just the practice of talking, to traders over many years,
Yeah,
when I was
yeah,
a journalist, doing benchmark pricing,
yeah,
that people all very commonly used SIF,
I
and
know,
for whatever mode of transport,
I know.
just talking about the destination and the insurance, and also for container
Yeah,
goods.
yeah,
Am I right that there could be a risk in that term, for example, in the situation that we've seen in recent years, where if let's say there is a high value ore, sometimes there has been a theft where a container has been emptied, something like rocks or cement loaded in, and the shipping company is none the wiser when it leaves port.
yeah,
And it's only when it arrives that it's open and turns
yeah,
out it's something completely different.
yeah.
So is that the kind of risk you're talking about?
Yes, it is, Polina, because the big risk is, if everything goes smoothly there, and if the wrong term is being used, but everything goes smoothly, there's no problem. But in the kind of situation you're talking about, and I am going to show you a case study right at the end today. But the big risk is, and we're seeing this more and more and more, is insurance companies are saying the wrong term has been used. We are not going to pay the claim. And that's been upheld by courts globally. Now, 5 years ago, I wouldn't say that was a great risk. Most insurance companies would pay up even when a wrong term has been used. But I think, frankly, the insurance industry were getting a bit fed up with it. And I'm going to give you an example later on. When we finish today, I'll be giving you a real life example, something that really happened, where an insurance company refused to pay a claim. And I think from memory, the claim was about over £1 million. So, 1400, yeah, over £1 million. So something like $1,400,000, something like that. So that is the big risk. If a wrong term is used, it does give insurance companies a get out clause from paying a claim. That really is the big danger. But you're right to say that it's a very common thing to use a wrong term. It really is a global issue. It's a very, very big issue, unfortunately. So does that answer that point so far, Polina? But as I say, I show a case study right at the end.
Yes, thank you, John.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, any other questions on that? Any other concerns about that?
What is about DDU?
John,
Sorry?
I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
DDU.
DDU has gone. It doesn't exist anymore. It went in terms 2010. So
Okay.
now that it's the equivalent now is DAP, delivered at place. Okay, delivered at place replaces DDU. The meaning is the same because with DDU, delivered duty unpaid, that can be any place in the country of arrival. DAP can be any place in the country of arrival. So DAP is a one-for-one replacement for DPU, which disappeared in 2010.
John,
You
I
mean
have a question.
DDU, John?
I'm sorry.
You mean DDU, John, not DPU, because
DDU.
yeah.
DDU, the same thing. It went in 2010. DDU was removed in 2010, replaced by DAP.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I have a question, John.
Please go ahead.
Back to STB, said to be, you explained that since you cannot see into the containers,
Yeah.
you can't say what's in them. You just say that said to be have metals in them. But
yeah.
But did you say that's on the bill of lading?
Yes.
But the bill of lading is filled out, I thought, by the person who's sending out the goods, so they would know what's inside.
No, the bill of lading is certified by the shipping line. So even if the shipper, the exporter, has blanks of the bill of lading and they print them off themselves, okay, the shipping line will always insist on the wording said to be or said to contain, because the shipping line have no visibility
Oh,
what's in
they're the ones who can't see it. Now I understand. So the one
exactly.
who's,
Yeah,
right.
exactly,
So
exactly. It's the shipping
the
line that
exporter, of course, knows darn well what's in there, but they have to say that because the shipping line cannot see into the container. I understand.
exactly. And you know, it's
Thank
a
you.
really good point. And next week we're going to look at supply chain security. And one
Yeah.
of the principles of supply chain security is that it's even more detailed than just saying the exporter knows what's in the container. And you know, um, when we talk about supply chain security next week and the World Customs Organization safe framework, one of the key points about supply chain security, and this comes up in court over and over again, is that actually the only person who knows what's in a container is the man or the woman who loaded that container. Everyone knows what the paperwork says. Everyone knows what the intention was to put in that container. Um, but the only person who really knows is the man or the woman who loaded it. No other person knows. They load it, they put a seal on the container doors, and the container goes off. So you've raised a really good point, and that's going to be even relevant next week when we talk about supply chain security. But absolutely right. It's the shipping line saying, we've got no idea. We know what you've told us. We know what the paperwork says, but we have no idea what's in that metal box. So we're going to say 120-foot container said to be or said to contain or whatever the product is. Yeah, great. Any other questions or comments? Some really good points coming out, which is fantastic. Anything else anyone wants to raise before we move on? Okay. So in terms of risk, the seller's risk, the buyer's risk, looking at it by group, with the E group terms, risk passes from seller to buyer at the seller's premises, at the supplier's premises. With the F terms, risk passes from the seller to the buyer when the cargo is passed to the carrier in the country of dispatch. With the C group, risk passes when the cargo is passed to the carrier in the country of dispatch. D terms, risk passes from the seller to the buyer in the country of arrival. So really quick question. Just in relation to risk and nothing else, just thinking about the risk, what is the difference in where the risk passes? What's the difference between the F terms and the C terms? Only in relation to where the risk passes from seller to buyer. What's the difference between F terms and C terms? And the clue is the answer is on the screen.
Career? Is that the answer, the career?
Sorry, say that again, please.
So the difference between F and C, that the risk passes when it's C, right? The risk passes when the courier just took the material or container, let's say.
And what
While
about?
Am I right?
Well, what does the screen say?
On the screen, there is no difference between the two.
Exactly, Paulina. There is no difference at all. There is absolutely no difference. Whether it's an F term or a C term, risk passes when the cargo is passed to the carrier in the country of dispatch. There is no difference at all in relation to where the goods are legally delivered and thus where the risk passes from seller to buyer. It's the same in the F terms as in the C terms. No difference whatsoever. Okay, so it's a bit naughty of me. It's a bit of a trick question, but you're absolutely right, Paulina. There is no difference. Okay, so the confusion, I think, the tricky terms are the C terms, CIF, CIP, CPT, CFR, because remember with the C terms, you've got the two critical points. With the C terms, the seller pays the freight cost up to arrival, just like with the D terms. Okay. However, with the C terms, the seller's risk ends and the seller legally delivers in exactly the same place as the F terms. So, that's the confusing things about CPT, CIP, CFR, CIF. There are two critical points. You've got risk and legal delivery exactly the same as the F group terms, but the place of arrival where the seller has got to get the goods to exactly the same as the D group. So if you like, C group is a compromise. C group means, yeah, the seller has the contract of carriage up to arrival, but they don't have the risk of carriage up to arrival. Legal delivery is on dispatch, not on arrival. So the C group terms provide a really good compromise. So key points to consider: FOB, FCA, CFR, CIF. I'm sorry, there's a mistake on that slide. Forgive me. That should be FOB, FAS. I beg your pardon. So ignore where it says FCA there. I've just noticed the error there. Really apologize for that. I should have noticed that in my proofreading. So FOB, FAS, CFR, CIF, only for bulk cargoes, not for container cargoes. So just to say that again, there's a mistake there. It says FCA, it should say FAS. Okay, that's a key thing. FOB, FAS, CFR, CIF, only for bulk maritime, not for container cargoes. Ex Works, the buyer is both exporter of record and importer of record. DDP, the seller, is both exporter of record and importer of record, and both those situations are tricky, because in both those situations, in Ex Works, you've got the buyer who is responsible for customs clearance at origin and also on arrival. And generally, that means they would have to be registered at origin. With DDP, the seller is responsible for customs at export and on arrival, at export and import. So, that can be a really difficult situation. And remember, with the C group terms, the legal delivery point where risk passes from seller to buyer and the physical delivery point are not the same. Okay, the legal delivery point is dispatch, the physical delivery point is arrival. And for DDP, if any of you attempted to use it when you're selling, there are some really good warnings there which may help you. Okay, so think about this. So you're a seller. You've got an order to get some material to Abuja, which is an inland point. It's the capital of Nigeria. So the options you've got are CPT Abuja or DAP Abuja. The goods are going, say, by container sea freight. The cost is going to be exactly the same because you're delivering to exactly the same point. So, the freight rate's going to be identical. The cost is going to be the same. As the seller, which one are you going to go for? What's the difference between them? So you're delivering to the same point, which is Abuja in Nigeria, and therefore the cost is going to be the same. What is going to be the difference between them, the main difference? Any thoughts on that?
The place of risk transfer.
Exactly. So as a seller, what's going to be your preference?
As a seller, CPT.
Exactly right. Because with CPT, your risk ends on dispatch. With DAP, your risk ends on arrival. So exactly right. That's the key difference between them. It's the question of risk. With CPT, you legally deliver when you dispatch the goods, not when they arrive in Abuja, when you dispatch them. That's where your risk ends, because that's where you've legally delivered. With DAP, you've only legally delivered when the goods arrive, so your risk ends on arrival. Absolutely right, textbook answer. So each Incoterm has 10 articles, A1 to 10 and B1 to 10. The A articles are the seller's obligations and the B articles are the buyer's obligations. Okay, so for each of the 11 terms, you get A1 to 10 and you get B1 to 10. and they link with each other. There's no gaps between them. So just to very, very briefly give you some examples. Now, A1 and B1, those are identical for each of the 11 terms. There's no difference at all in the 11 terms for A1 and B1. And I will actually, in fact, I'll read those to you. Let me just pick any one of them. What have I got here? Okay, so let's have a look at CPT A1. The seller must provide the goods and the commercial invoice in conformity with the contracts of sale and any other evidence of conformity that may be required by the contract. Any document to be provided by the seller may be in paper or electronic form as agreed, or where there is no agreement as is customary. That's A1, general obligation for the seller. B1, under CPT, the buyer must pay the price of the goods as provided in the contract of sale. Any document to be provided by the buyer may be in paper or electronic form as agreed, or where there is no agreement as is customary. So in each of the 11 terms, A1 and B1 are actually identical. There's no difference. And basically it's saying A1, the seller must provide the right goods as stipulated in the contract of sale. B1, the buyer must pay the agreed price. A2 and B2 is delivery and taking delivery. And here we're talking about legal delivery. So if we take CPT, A2, and I'm going to paraphrase here for speed, I'm going to paraphrase rather than reading it to you, but I just want you to get a feel for it. So with CPT, A2 will say the seller will legally deliver the goods when the goods are delivered to the first carrier in the country of dispatch. And B2 will say the buyer must take delivery from the time the goods are handed to the first carrier in the country of dispatch. So the point at which the seller legally delivers the goods, the buyer must take delivery. A2 is where the seller legally delivers to, and B2 is that point at which the buyer must take delivery. A3 and B3, transfer of risk. So let's take FOB. A3 will say, this, and again, as I say, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm not using the actual wording. A3 will say, the seller bears the risk of the goods until they're loaded on board the vessel at the port of loading. And B3 will say, the buyer must take the risk of the goods from the time they're loaded on the vessel at the port of loading. A4 and B4 are contract of carriage. Who holds the contract of carriage? So for the C group and D group terms, A4 will say the seller holds the contract of carriage, and B4 will say no obligation. With the F group terms, A4 will say no obligation, B4 will say the buyer holds the contract of carriage. And that links with A6 and B6, which is the delivery and transport document. Who holds the delivery and transport document? A7 and B7 are customs clearance. So A7, for example, with DDP. With DDP, A7, in other words, the seller's obligation, A7 will say the seller must arrange export and import customs clearance. B7 will say no obligation, because under DDP, the seller has to arrange both export and import clearance, but the buyer has no obligation to do either. So under DDP, B7 will say no obligation. I didn't mention A5 and B5. A5 and B5 are insurance, and that's really simple. B5 is always no obligation for each of the 11 terms. The buyer is never obliged to insure the goods. A5 will say no obligation apart from CIP and CIF. So B5 is always no obligation. A5 is no obligation apart from CIP and CIF. So for CIP, for example, A5 will say the seller must insure the goods on behalf of the buyer and against the buyer's risk. B5 will say no obligation. 6 and 7 we've covered. A8 and B8, checking, packing and marking the goods is always the seller's obligation. So A8 will always say the seller has the obligation for any checking, packing or marking the goods. B8 will always say no obligation. For each of the 11 terms, B8 is no obligation. Allocation of costs for each of the 11 terms, A9 is what the seller has to pay for, and B9 is what the buyer has to pay for. So no argument about it. It's all in one place. A9 is what the seller pays, B9 is what the buyer pays. Notices A10 and B10. A10 is information the seller must give the buyer on request, and B10 is information the buyer must give the seller on request. So each of the 11 terms will be divided into A1 to 10 and B1 to 10, and this is how it looks in the book. There's an example of CPT. Now, do remember, and I know you're fed up with me saying this, but I don't apologize for saying it once more. The only true source of Incoterms is that book. Okay, that's the book that has the correct detail. It is the only correct version of Incoterms. All right, so that's an example of how it looks in the book. A1 to 10 are in blue on the left. B1 to 10, the buyer's obligations, are in brown or orange on the right of the book. Also, for each of the 11 terms, you'll get a set of explanatory notes. There's an example of them there. They're not part of the legal text. They're purely an explanation of how that term is designed to be used. So for each of the 11 terms, before you get to the legal text of the terms, you will get those explanatory notes. There's also, and this is actually new in Incoterms 2020, there's a term-by-term article comparison. So for example, if you want to see the difference between carriage obligations between all the 11 terms, you can look that up. That's in the book. You know, it's an innovation in the book. I think, you know, on reflection, I think many of us who got involved in the review, we thought it's really not that useful. But in fact, what we've discovered since then is that lawyers particularly do find it very, very useful as a reference. So I think that's a reality. It's new in Incoterms 2020. It's not part of the legal text. For everyday use, it's not used very much. But, you know, I think we are finding the lawyers are finding it quite useful. Okay, so for those of you who remember Incoterms 2010, the previous version, these are some of the key changes, and then we'll look at the current changes that happened in Incoterms 2020. So in Incoterms 2010, shorter, clearer introductions. For the first time in Incoterms, the wording was tweaked so that you could use Incoterms for domestic trade if you want to. Prior to 2010, you couldn't really use Incoterms for domestic trade, only for international. But the reason we tweaked the wording in 2010 is because in the States we were hearing that one of the reasons why they use the American foreign trade definitions is because the AFTDs work for domestic trade. So what we thought was, by just tweaking the wording to make the terms usable for domestic trade as well as international trade, we would encourage the US to use Incoterms for all their trade, whether domestic or international. And that has worked to an extent. I wouldn't say to a full extent, but to some extent that has worked. In Incoterms 2010, we really underlined the fact that Ex Works is recommended only for domestic trade and not for international trade. You know, there's a term that we use, a phrase that we use. It's a kind of throwaway term, but the throwaway term is Ex Works never works and DDP is deadly dangerous practice. The two extreme Incoterms are really problematic. In fact, in the 2020 review, we nearly removed them. They've stayed actually because many countries wanted to keep them, but they were nearly removed from Incoterms. So, you know, something to have in your back of your mind. X works, never works. DDP, deadly dangerous practice. In Incoterms 2010, because it was something new, we had to include carrying out security formalities. It was, you know, in 2010, we really tried to get over this problem of people using CIF, FOB, CFR, FAS for containerized shipments. It's been a problem, you know, at that time it had been a problem for 30 years. And we didn't know how to get over it. You know, you need to keep the terms for bulk shipment because, you know, some cargoes are moved in bulk. People charter ships, you know, large cargoes of metal are going to be shipped by bulk charter ship. So we had to keep those terms. But what we did in Incoterms 2010, we've done the same in 2020, is we've separated those terms for the multimodal terms. We've put the bulk sea freight terms right at the back of the Incoterms book. All the other terms are in their group. But the terms FAS, FOB, CFR, CIF, they're right at the back of the book. And we've done the same thing in Incoterms 2020. In 2010, we recognized that the migration to e-commerce, to using digital messages instead of paper documents, we recognized that that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. So we reduced the wording on electronic documents to make it very, very simple and very straightforward. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit later on. We reviewed and reduced the D terms. Before 2010, there were loads of D terms. You had delivered at frontier, delivered ex ship, delivered duty unpaid. There were loads of D terms. We reduced them. We replaced DDU, if I can remember them all, delivered ex key, delivered ex ship, delivered duty unpaid. We replaced those for one term, DAP. So we managed to reduce the number of D terms. We updated insurance provisions, and the point of risk transfer for FOB, CFR, and CIF, it used to be the ship's rail. We changed that to loading on board the ship. In other words, it is now later than the ship's rail. So those were the big changes in 2010. In 2020, these were the changes. These were the major changes. DPU replaces DAT. I spoke about that a bit earlier on. The biggest change, I think, is the revised insurance provision for CIP and CIF, which I'll talk about a bit later on, and also next week when we talk about insurance. So that was the really big change. Because CIF is only for bulk cargoes, it doesn't need the same level of insurance as containerized cargoes or road or rail or air cargoes. So we've made a very, very big change there. And that's another reason why it's important to use the right term, because if you use the wrong term, you can end up with the wrong level of insurance. The order of the articles, A1 to 10 and B1 to 10, we've changed the order of them to make them more logical. We've given clearer introductions. We've put, you know, I mentioned this earlier on, we've put a page in there on what Incoterms do not do, just to dispel some myths. That's an innovation in Incoterms 2020, but we did think it was quite important to do that. So a bit of an innovation, having some sections on what Incoterms don't do. There was an issue which frankly came out in 2010, but we didn't do anything about it because we didn't know what to do. Now, the issue was, if payment is by something like letter of credit or documentary collection, which we're going to talk about next week, then in most cases, banks that open letters of credit, they would expect to see on board bills of lading presented to the bank in return for payment. Now, if it's a container shipment, legal delivery is before the goods are placed on the ship, and therefore the seller would not be entitled to get the bills of lading because they're not placing the goods on the ship. And that's an issue, because if the seller needs the onboard bills of lading to get paid, under FCA, CPT, and CIP, they can't get, under FCA, they can't get the bills of lading. They're not entitled to them. And that's been a problem for a while, and we really didn't know what to do about it. So we've corrected that in Incoterms 2020. And in Incoterms 2020, it states that if the seller needs an onboard transport document in order to elicit payment under something like a letter of credit, then the buyer must present that document to the seller so that the seller can get paid. So we have actually addressed that and we've rectified it, which is a good thing. Previous versions of Incoterms had, when you were looking at when you were trying to find out what the seller's got to pay for, what the buyer's got to pay for, you'd have to look all over A1 to 10 and B1 to 10. Now they've been centralized in clause 9 or article 9. So A9 is what the seller's got to pay for, B9 is what the buyer's got to pay for. Then the next one was quite interesting. When there's a review of Incoterms, generally in the review process, we get opinions in from every country in the world. And we look for patterns. If a number of respondents or a number of countries are saying the same thing is an issue for them, then we think, okay, that may well be an issue. That's something we need to look at. But when it's just one country, or maybe two countries that come up with something, it's unlikely to trigger a change because it's likely to be something very specific. But that's not always the case. And in Incoterms 2020, we suddenly identified there really was a gap. And that was identified actually by the representative from Cambodia. And in Cambodia, a very, very important export is clothing. Okay, in Cambodia, they make a lot of clothing exported all over the world. And they said to us, their working group in Cambodia, they said, we've got a problem. And we said, what's that? And they said, well, it's very difficult for us in Cambodia to use Incoterms for certain trades. And we said, why? And they said, well, one of the models that's used, and I'm not an expert on clothing, as I mentioned yesterday, I'm pretty agnostic to products. But they said, one of the models is they grow the cotton in Cambodia and then they send it next door to Vietnam where it's turned into yarn. And then it comes back to Cambodia where they turn it into shirts and blouses and everything else. And we said, yeah, and what's the problem? And they said, well, the problem is when they send it to Vietnam and bring it back, the sellers, the farms, cooperatives, they've got their own transport. They use their own vehicles to cross the border. And they said, if you look at Incoterms always talk about contracting the international transport. And they said to us, when they're using their own transport, they're not contracting. It's their own vehicles, their own trucks. They're not contracting to a third-party provider. But because Incoterms mention either the seller or the buyer contracts the transport, we can't comply with that, or they can't comply with that because they're not contracting. And we suddenly thought they've got a really good point. So we simply tweaked the wording to say the seller, depending on the term, the seller or the buyer contracts or arranges the international transport. Normally, it would be contracting the transport. But if they've got their own vehicles, they're not contracting, they're arranging. So just by adding the words or arranging, we resolve that problem. Once again, it was a problem that was nearly overlooked, and thank goodness we didn't overlook it because it's really relevant. Some of the big, for example, steel producers, they actually have they use their own transport. Sometimes they have their own ships. Sometimes they have their own railway wagons. So they're using their own transport. They're not contracting. So it was really important. It was one country that brought it to our attention, but it did trigger a change in the terms. And finally, explanatory notes. We just revised the explanatory notes, we updated them, and I think we use much, much clearer wording than in previous versions of the terms. So, whoops, sorry, let me just go back there. Now, I mentioned there's a key difference there with insurance under CIP and CIF. Now, I'm not going to talk about that in detail now, but we are going to talk about it in detail next week when we look at insurance. But this is another key reason why it's so important to use an appropriate term. Because for the first time in Incoterms, CIP and CIF have different levels of insurance. There are different insurance requirements. CIF will only cover bulk non-container cargoes. And one of the qualities of non-container bulk cargoes is they tend to have a relatively low value per ton. Whereas if the goods are in containers, they're going to have a higher value per ton. So there's a really big difference, a contextual difference between containerized cargoes and bulk cargoes. And we recognize that because of that, different levels of insurance are appropriate for CIP and CIF. So again, without going into the detail now, whereas previously CIP and CIF attracted the same level of insurance, which is Institute Cargo Clause C, which is a very low level of insurance. That has now changed. CIF is unchanged. It's still Clause C under Incoterms, which is a low level of insurance, but CIP is now Clause A, which is all risks insurance. So we'll dig down into more of that next week, into more detail on that. But that's the biggest change in Incoterms 2020. Okay, so which one to use? And Freya, this is going back to the really good point you were asking about earlier on. And it's going to be a decision-making risk, which Incoterm to use. So this is the kind of thought process. Firstly, what's the mode of transport? Is it bulk sea freight or is it anything else? So if it's bulk, non-container sea freight, it's going to be FAS, FOB, CFR or CIF. If it's anything else, if it's container sea freight, if it's road, rail or air or a mixture of those, then it's going to be one of the other 7 terms. So that's going to be the first question. Is it bulk, non-container sea freight, or is it something else? That's the first question. What's the mode of transport? The second question is, what's the risk appetite of the parties? And this is going to be open to negotiation. A buyer may well say, I want to buy from you under a D Incoterm. I want you, the seller, to have the risk. And the seller may say, okay, we're prepared to take the risk, we'll contract under a D Incoterm. Or the seller may say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do DAP, Abuja, Nigeria. We're not prepared to take the risk. We will do CPT or CIP, Abuja, Nigeria. So that's going to be the second question. What's the risk profile of the seller or buyer? And very, very often, that's going to be a matter of negotiation. Then the payment method, and again, we'll link this next week. But essentially, I'm going to ask you just to believe me for the moment, and then we'll talk about the detail next week. If you're getting paid, if the seller is getting paid by letter of credit, you can't use a D Incoterm. Now, that's not normally an issue because if a D Incoterm is being used, that would suggest a low risk transaction. And if it's a low risk transaction, you're probably not going to use a letter of credit anyway. Okay, but it's a fact for technical reasons, you can't use a D group Incoterm if payments by letter of credit. So that's the next question. What is the method of payment in the contract? Now, some countries have regulations, not very many, in fact, very, very few, but some countries do have regulations. For example, if you sell to Nigeria, under Nigerian law, the contract has got to be CFR or CPT. That's what Nigerian federal law says. All the imports into Nigeria have got to be CFR for bulk cargoes or for anything else CPT. So rarely, but sometimes there may be regulations in the buyer's country. And sometimes it's good just to look at normal practice. What are most people doing for this particular kind of trade? So for example, for trades within the European Union, actually within the European Union, normally they're going to be on an FCA or CPT basis. That's what's normal. They don't have to be. There's nothing to say they have to be, but that's what most people do. So, you know, if you want to get a broad spectrum, what are most people doing? It's good to look at normal practice. Then The next two kind of link with each other, remembering that the documents in international trade represent the goods and control of the transaction. So from the seller's point of view, the exporter's point of view, if they want to be absolutely sure of where the goods are going, then they have to contract under a C term or a D term where they hold the contract of carriage. Because remember, with an E term or an F term, the seller doesn't have the contract of carriage. The seller only has the contract of carriage with C terms or D terms. Now, that can be an issue because the seller is, and there may be very good reasons. The goods may be licensable. They may be dual use. There may be an export license, say we will, where the country of export says we will grant a license if the goods are going to Singapore. But if the goods are diverted to another country, that could breach the license. And there could be sanctions implications as well. So if the seller wants or needs control over the transaction, they need to contract under a C term or under a D term. Because if they contract under an E or an F term, they know where the buyer tells them the goods are going, but the buyer may divert the goods. The buyer has the contract of carriage. So how much control of the transaction is needed? Very often, it's going to be cost control. Who gets the best freight rate, seller or buyer? If the seller gets the best freight rate, it makes sense to have a C group or D group contract. If the buyer gets the best freight rate, it's probably going to be best to have an F group contract. So very often that's what it's going to be about, cost control, who can get the better freight rate, the seller or the buyer. Then can you do it well? If you're the seller, can you do what you're being asked to do? You're asked to contract DDP Timbuktu Mali. Can you actually get the goods to Timbuktu in Mali? Can you be the importer of record in Mali? Can you pay duty in Mali? Or are there constraints? Would you have to register there to do a DDP transaction to be the importer of record? So there may be country constraints. Whatever you're being asked to do, of course you want to keep the customer happy, but can you actually do it? And can you legally do it? And importantly, from the seller's point of view, can you safely do it? That's really important. So that's the kind of thought process to go through when you're deciding what Incoterm to use in a contract. So Freya and anyone else, any questions on that? Any comments on that?
No, not from me. Thank you for explaining it.
John, there's a couple of points in the chat that obviously from the seller's perspective, for example, if you're sending something to Nigeria, CPT is better than, say, DDP because you don't take all the risk of customs clearing the goods into Nigeria. But isn't DDP what, for example, Amazon deliveries would fall under? Because it seems that that's the ultimate Incoterm for a buyer. That's what the buyer wants. Well, that's what would keep a buyer happy. They don't have to take any risk. It lands on their doorstep.
I always get asked this. Fortunately, there is case law on this. And judges always come up with the same thing, that Incoterms are for business-to-business operations. Okay? If you buy something on Amazon, what judges always say is you cannot expect private individuals to understand Incoterms, and therefore Incoterms do not apply to that kind of purchasing because it's a business to consumer. So for business to consumer, Incoterms don't apply. And that's come up in case law, I think, about 6 times now. So I think it's pretty firm case law. Judges always say the same thing, that, judges would always say, we expect business to understand Incoterms. We cannot expect consumers to understand them. So that's the judgment judges always give. And, I get asked this a lot by family and friends, in fact. They say, what about when I buy something from Amazon, if it's broken? And I say to them, look, There's no standard conditions for that. You've got to look at Amazon conditions. You've got to look at them really, really, really clearly, because there are no standard trading terms. Even though sometimes these platforms try to use them, these platforms do try and use them. And actually, it's strange you should say this, because I haven't responded to it yet. But yesterday I had a request from Amazon for some training in Incoterms. But I'm going to discuss this with Amazon because, frankly, I don't think they need it. Because, you know, when they're selling to consumers, any judge would say Incoterms don't apply. Okay.
Thank you, John. I
You're
guess
welcome.
Amazon also has business accounts, so it might be that.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. That's very true. Okay, so incorporating into the contract, the bit in red you can see there, that's the important bit. To be protected by Incoterms, they must be mentioned by name in the contract. So to have the protection of Incoterms, there are three things you would expect to see. You would expect to see Incoterms rules, that terminology. You would expect to see the three-letter code, and you would expect to see the named place of physical delivery. And there you can see an example in red there, subject to Incoterms 2020 rules, CIP Singapore. That's the kind of wording, that's the model you would expect to see in the contract and also on the invoices as well. Subject to Incoterms 2020 rules, CIP Singapore. If the word Incoterm rules is missing, if the three-letter code is missing, if the named place is missing, you don't have the protection of Incoterms. So it's the three-point checklist. Mention the rules, mention the three-letter code, and mention the agreed physical delivery point. So I promised you a case study. Nothing would go wrong, or will it? This really happened in the UK. And just to prove it to you, this was a while ago, but there's the newspaper that actually had an article about it. So we're not really interested in the runners fractured, whatever it was, or the crooks targeting an empty house. The headline we're interested in, delays as lorry plows into a bridge on the A12. And the A12, you know, many of you won't know, it's a trunk route in the UK. It goes, it goes between Thamesport docks in the UK, which is on the Thames, and a city called Colchester in the east of the UK, the east of England. So what happens? And I'm going to go through this really quickly. So this company in Colchester, their businesses, they buy ships' engines, really big ships' engines, they renovate them and they resell them. Okay, that's what their business is. So they bought 3 ships' engines from Brazil. They're going to overhaul them. They're going to sell them. In the contract that they have with the company in Brazil, the Incoterm in the contract was CIF Tilbury Docks. Their workshop is based in Colchester, which is 40 miles to the east of London. A transport company goes in to collect the engines when the ship arrives and deliver them to Colchester. The transport company goes in, they miscalculate the height of the load, and they use the wrong kind of trucks. Okay, they should be using low loaders, they use standard trailers. This is the unbelievable bit, but this is absolutely true. They pick up the 3 engines, there are 2 trucks, they put 2 engines on 1 truck and the 3rd engine on the 3rd truck. This is the unbelievable bit, but it's true. They collect the engines from Tilbury, they're driving them to Colchester. On the way to Colchester, each truck crashes into 3 bridges. Can you believe that? The first truck goes onto the first bridge, it's a railway bridge, and they knock some bricks off the bridge. They don't stop, they go straight through. The second truck follows and does exactly the same thing. And they do that with 3 bridges. Each of the 3 bridges, first truck goes through, crashes into the bridge, and the second truck does exactly the same thing. They cause £1.5 million of damage. And there are some pictures. And I'm going to ask you to look at the way the goods have been shipped, as well as looking at the pictures. So, you need to be fairly technical, I think, to see, but that engine's been really badly damaged. So the issues and the outcome, without going into huge detail here, as you can see there, 0.9 total loss, £1,352,500. Now, the seller wasn't worried. Sorry, the buyer wasn't worried. Well, the seller wasn't either. The seller wasn't worried because they knew their risk ended in Brazil. It was CIF. So their risk ended in Brazil. The buyer wasn't worried. They thought it's a CIF contract. There's an I in the Incoterm. We're insured. The seller has insured the cargo on our behalf. So the buyer in Colchester, they know they've got to pay the seller. They pay the seller, and then they make a claim on the insurance company. And they have to do that. They've got to pay the seller because the seller's risk ended in Brazil. They know that, so they pay the seller for the goods, and then they make a claim on the insurance company. Do you think that the loss of £1,352,500, and that was the cost of the damage, could that be claimed from the insurance company? What do you think? Just shout out if you think yes. Or shout out no if you think no.
No, perhaps. Because, the difference is CIP clause A was not applied.
Yeah, well, exactly. So really what we're coming to here is you've got to look at, if we just go back, you've got to look at how the goods are shipped. They've been shipped on a flat rack container. That's a container shipment. Okay, it's not a standard closed container, but that doesn't matter. There are different kinds of containers. It's a flat rack container. Very, very clearly, it should have been CIP, not CIF. The contract said CIF. So basically, the insurance company said, "Niet, we are not paying." They said, "We're not paying for two reasons. Firstly, the incorrect Incoterm had been used in the contract. The Incoterm said CIF, but it should have been CIP because the goods were loaded on a container. It should have been CIP. And also, there was no extension for the road part of the journey. Containers go by sea and by road, but there was no extension for the road part of the journey. So the insurance company said, absolutely not. We're not paying 1 penny. We're not paying 1 cent. The importer got a recovery from the haulage company, but remember, carrier's liability is really low. It's not the full value of the goods. So they got a small recovery from the haulier. They did get a small recovery, but not nearly enough. They got £1,300 a ton. That wasn't nearly enough for the value of the goods. It nearly put the company out of business. Very, very nearly, simply because they used the wrong Incoterm in the contract. So I said I'd give you a case study, a true one, and that was one of them. So some key points there, and I can see we're running out of time here. We always do on Incoterms. So very, very quickly, some key points. Remember, when you give the physical delivery point, you've got to give an accurate point of arrival as agreed in the contract. You've got to mention Incoterms in the contract. You mustn't use bulk terms for other methods of transport. Remember, American foreign trade definitions are completely different to Incoterms. Remember, with C group terms, it can get really confusing because we've got the two delivery points. We've got legal delivery on dispatch, physical delivery on arrival. Never do more than the term requires. For example, with Ex Works, the buyer has to load the truck that collects the goods. Very, very often the seller will load the truck because the seller's got the crane, the forklift or whatever. But remember, with Ex Works, never load the collecting vehicle. Okay, the seller has to do their own load. Sorry, the buyer has to do their own loading. Never do more than the term allows. So those are some of the key points. I also said I would give you an example of the difference between Incoterms and the AFTDs, the American Foreign Trade Definitions. And there's one example there, the same acronym FOB, but a completely different meaning. In the American terms, FOB can apply to any mode of transport, and it's a bit like FCA under Incoterms. It's completely different to FOB. Okay, with Incoterms FOB, it's bulk sea freight only, and risk passes are when the cargo is loaded on the deck of a vessel. It can only be used for bulk sea freight. Okay, so there we go. Whoops. Oh, did that too quickly. Just to summarize, remember to make sure you're covered by Incoterms in the contract. Make sure you've got the 3-letter code. Make sure you've got the named place of physical arrival, and mention Incoterms rules. Really, really important. And those are some examples you can see there. Okay, so I know it is time now. You know, I was hoping we'd finish a bit earlier, but Incoterms always attracts a lot of attention. But I'm happy to stay on for as long as you want me to. So any questions at all, any comments about Incoterms? We can also pick up questions next week when we reconvene, but really happy to take any questions now.
John, can you go back and find the screen where you showed the Inco Group F?
Oh gosh, right back. Yeah.
Is it possible? If it's a big deal, don't worry.
Okay, I can flick back. Why? Do you have a question? While I'm doing that, do you have a question on it that I can
No,
start
I
to
just wanted to see it again.
Oh, okay. There we go.
Oh, good, good. So hold it there for a minute. Okay, thank
Okay.
you. Okay, got it. Thank you.
You got it?
Yep.
Okay, brilliant, brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I will also send the slides out after this session, so you will get the slides for part 1 and part 2. This session is being recorded, so if you would like a recording, once it's finished, I can send that to you as well. Please don't hesitate to ask questions now, or if a question comes up on your mind afterwards, send it our way to pauline@mmta.co.uk.
So, any questions? While your minds are fresh about this, any questions? Any key takeaways that you want to talk about?
So one question, is a CIP for any mode of transport?
Yeah, apart from bulk sea freight, but any other mode of transport, it's for container sea freight, air, road, rail, or any multimodal mixture of those. So absolutely, Paulina, any mode of transport except for bulk sea freight.
Okay, let's see if we have another question. I think not
Okay.
at this point.
Anything else? Okay, so Paulina, while I remember, can I ask, do you recall there was one slide where I've made a mistake on it? If you wouldn't mind correcting that before you send it out.
Yes, I will do.
Have you made them?
Thank,
Okay,
thanks,
that's
John.
brilliant.
I can
Really,
do that before the slide is sent.
oh, lovely, lovely. Really sorry about that, guys. That's my bad. I should have noticed that. So I apologize for that mistake, but we'll correct that.
John.
Once again, a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been useful. Incoterms right at the center of every international trade contract. So it's a really important protocol. You know, if you do have any issues about that, as I say, we can pick them up next week. The next session on Monday, which is, oh, sorry, I've stopped the presentation, but it's about shipping, it's about customs, it's about insurance. We'll have time on that to pick up anything else you want to ask about Incoterms, or anything we did yesterday for that matter. So we'll have time to pick that up, and we'll certainly do that. You know, don't have nightmares, don't have bad dreams, don't lose sleep over it, because any questions can be answered. So if there's nothing else, it just remains for me to say thanks very, very much, everyone, for your attention, which I really appreciate. Hope it's been useful. Have a lovely day for those of you in the States. For the rest of you, have a lovely evening. Paulina, thank you very much for your organisation. And over to you. Anything else to finish off with?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for everyone. Just to remind you, the next session, which will be on logistics, so transport, customs, insurance, will be on Monday, the 6th of October at the same time, again, 1 p.m. UK, which is +1 UTC +1 hour, and until 4:30 with a break. It will be on the same link, so you can log in on the link you had today. I will send out a reminder beforehand. So I will see you then, and if any questions crop up in your mind after this session, please email me at paulina@mmta.co.uk. I will put it in the chat now. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks very much, everyone. See you next week. Thanks, Polina.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye now.